Canto 13 of Don Juan by Gordon, Lord of Byron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Peter Gallagher. I now mean to be serious. It is time, since laughter nowadays is deemed too serious. A jest at vice by virtues called a crime, and critically held as deleterious. Besides, the sad's a source of the sublime, although when long a little apt to weary us, and therefore shall my lay soar high and solemn as an old temple, dwindled to a column. The Lady Adeline Amundeville, 'tis an old Norman name, and to be found in pedigrees by those who wander still along the last fields of that Gothic ground, was high born, wealthy by her father's will, and beauteous even where beauties most abound, in Britain, which of course true patriots find the goodliest soil of body and of mind. I'll not gainsay them, it is not my cue, I'll leave them to their taste, no doubt the best. An eye is an eye, and whether black or blue is no great matter, so 'tis in request. 'Tis nonsense to dispute about a hue, the kindest may be taken as a test. The fair sex should be always fair, and no man till 30 should perceive there's a plain woman. And after that serene and somewhat dull epoch, that awkward corner turned for days more quiet, when our moon's no more at full, we may presume to criticise or praise, because indifference begins to lull our passions, and we walk in wisdom's ways; also because the figure and the face hint that 'tis time to give the younger place. I know that some would fain postpone this era, reluctant as all placemen to resign their post, but theirs is merely a chimera, for they have passed life's equinoctial line. But then they have their claret and Madeira to irrigate the dryness of decline, and country meetings, and the Parliament, and debt, and what not, for their solace sent. And is there not religion and reform, peace, war, the taxes, and what's called the nation, the struggle to be pilots in a storm, the landed and the money'd speculation, the joys of mutual hate to keep them warm instead of love, that mere hallucination? Now hatred is by far the longest pleasure. Men love in haste, but they detest at leisure. Rough Johnson, the great moralist, professed right honestly he liked an honest hater. The only truth that yet has been confess'd within these latest 1,000 years or later. Perhaps the fine old fellow spoke in jest. For my part, I am but a mere spectator, and gaze where'er the palace or the hovel is, much in the mode of Goethe's Mephistopheles, but neither love nor hate in much excess, though 'twas not once so. If I sneer sometimes, it is because I cannot well do less, and now and then it also suits my rhymes. I should be very willing to redress men's wrongs, and rather check than punish crimes, had not Cervantes, in that too true tale of Quixote, shown how all such efforts fail. Of all tales 'tis the saddest, and more sad because it makes us smile. His hero's right, and still pursues the right. To curb the bad his only object, and 'gainst odds to fight his guerdon. 'Tis his virtue makes him mad. But his adventures form a sorry sight. A sorrier still is the great moral taught by that real epic unto all who have thought. Redressing injury, revenging wrong, to aid the damsel and destroy the caitiff, opposing singly the united strong, from foreign yoke to free the helpless native. Alas! must noblest views, like an old song, be for mere fancy's sport a theme creative, a jest, a riddle, fame through thick and thin sought, and Socrates himself but wisdom's Quixote? Cervantes smiled Spain's chivalry away. A single laugh demolished the right arm of his own country. Seldom since that day has Spain had heroes. While romance could charm, the world gave ground before her bright array, and therefore have his volumes done such harm, that all their glory as a composition was dearly purchased by his land's perdition. I'm at my old loonies, digression, and forget the Lady Adeline Amundeville, the fair most fatal Juan ever met, although she was not evil, nor meant ill. But destiny and passion spread the net, fate is a good excuse for our own will, and caught them. What do they not catch, methinks? But I'm not Oedipus, and life's a sphinx. I tell the tale as it is told, nor dare to venture a solution. Davus sum. And now I will proceed upon the pair. Sweet Adeline, amidst the gay world's hum, was the queen bee, the glass of all that's fair, whose charm made all men speak, and women dumb. The last's a miracle, and such was reckon'd, and since that time there has not been a second. Chaste was she to detraction's desperation, and wedded unto one she had loved well, a man known in the councils of the nation, cool and quite English, imperturbable, though apt to act with fire upon occasion, proud of himself and her. The world could tell nought against either, and both seem'd secure, she in her virtue, he in his hauteur. It chanced some diplomatical relations arising out of business often brought himself and Juan in their mutual stations into close contact. Although reserved, nor caught by specious seeming, Juan's youth and patience and talent on his haughty spirit wrought, and formed a basis of esteem, which ends in making men what courtesy calls friends. And thus Lord Henry, who was cautious as reserve and pride could make him, and full slow in judging men, when once his judgment was determined, right or wrong, on friend or foe, had all the pertinacity pride has, which knows no ebb to its imperious flows, and loves or hates, disdaining to be guided, because its own good pleasure hath decided. His friendships, therefore, and no less aversions, though oft well founded, which confirm'd but more his prepossessions, like the laws of Persians and Medes, would ne'er revoke what went before. His feelings had not those strange fits, like tertians, of common likings, which make some deplore what they should laugh at, the mere ague still of men's regard, the fever or the chill. 'Tis not in mortals to command success, but do you more, Sempronius, don't deserve it, and take my word, you won't have any less. Be wary, watch the time, and always serve it. Give gently way when there's too great a press, and for your conscience only learn to nerve it, for like a racer or a boxer training, 'twill make, if proved, vast efforts without paining. Lord Henry also liked to be superior, as most men do, the little or the great. The very lowest find out an inferior, at least they think so, to exert their state upon. For there are very few things wearier than solitary pride's oppressive weight, which mortals generously would divide by bidding others carry, while they ride. In birth, in rank, in fortune likewise equal, Lord Juan he could no distinction claim. In years he had the advantage of time's sequel, and, as he thought, in country much the same, because bold Britons have a tongue and free quill, at which all modern nations vainly aim, and the Lord Henry was a great debater, so that few members kept the house up later. These were advantages, and then he thought it was his foible, but by no means sinister, that few or none more than himself had caught court mysteries, having been himself a minister. He liked to teach that which he had been taught, and greatly shone wherever there had been a stir, and reconciled all qualities which grace man, always a patriot, and sometimes a placeman. He liked the gentle Spaniard for his gravity. He almost honoured him for his docility, because, though young, he acquiesced with suavity or contradicted, but with proud humility. He knew the world, and would not see depravity in faults which sometimes show the soil's fertility, if that the weeds all live not the first crop, for then they are very difficult to stop. And then he talked with him about Madrid, Constantinople, and such distant places where people always did as they were bid, or what they should not, with foreign graces. Of coursers also spoke they. Henry rid well, like most Englishmen, and loved the races, and Juan, like a true-born Andalusian, could back a horse as despots ride a Russian. And thus acquaintance grew at noble routs and diplomatic dinners, or at other, for Juan stood well both with ins and outs, as in Freemasonry, a higher brother. Upon his talent Henry had no doubts. His manner show'd him sprung from a high mother, and all men like to show their hospitality to him whose breeding matches with his quality. At Square, for we will break no squares by naming streets, since men are so censorious, and apt to sow an author's wheat with tares, reaping allusions private and inglorious, where none were dreamt of, unto love's affairs, which were or are to be notorious, that therefore I do previously declare Lord Henry's mansion was in Square. Also there been another pious reason for making squares and streets anonymous, which is, that there is scarce a single season which doth not shake some very splendid house with some slight heartquake of domestic treason. A topic scandal doth delight to rouse, such as I might stumble over unawares, unless I knew the very chastest squares. 'Tis true I might have chosen Piccadilly, a place where peccadilloes are unknown, but I have motives, whether wise or silly, for letting that pure sanctuary alone. Therefore I name not square, street, place, until I find one where nothing naughty can be shown, a vestal shrine of innocence of heart, such but I have lost the London chart. At Henry's mansion then, in Square, was Juan a recherché, welcome guest, as many other noble scions were, and some who had but talent for their crest, or wealth, which is a passport everywhere, or even mere fashion, which indeed's the best recommendation, and to be well dressed will very often supersede the rest. And since there's safety in a multitude of counsellors, as Solomon has said, or someone for him in some sage grave mood, indeed we'll see the daily proof displayed in senates, at the bar, in wordy feud, where'er collective wisdom can parade, which is the only cause that we can guess of Britain's present wealth and happiness. But as there's safety grafted in the number of counsellors for men, thus for the sex a large acquaintance lets not virtue slumber. Or should it shake, the choice will more perplex, variety itself will more encumber. Midst many rocks we guard more 'gainst wrecks, and thus with women, howsoe'er it shocks some self-love, there's safety in a crowd of coxcombs. But Adeline had not the least occasion for such a shield, which leaves but little merit to virtue proper, or good education. Her chief resource was in her own high spirit, which judged mankind at their due estimation, and for coquetry she disdained to wear it. Secure of admiration, its impression was faint, as of an everyday possession. To all she was polite without parade, to some she show'd attention of that kind which flatters, but is flattery convey'd in such a sort as cannot leave behind a trace unworthy either wife or maid. A gentle, genial courtesy of mind to those who were, or pass'd for meritorious, just to console sad glory for being glorious, which is in all respects, save now and then, a dull and desolate appendage. Gaze upon the shades of those distinguish'd men who were or are the puppet shows of praise, the praise of persecution. Gaze again on the most favour'd, and amidst the blaze of sunset halos, or the laurel brow'd, what can ye recognise? A gilded cloud. There also was, of course, in Adeline that calm patrician polish in the address, which ne'er can pass the equinoctial line of anything which nature would express, just as a mandarin finds nothing fine, at least his manners suffers not to guess that anything he views can greatly please. Perhaps we've borrowed this from the Chinese. Perhaps from Horace, his nil admirari was what he called the art of happiness, an art on which the artists greatly vary, and have not yet attained to much success. However, 'tis expedient to be wary. Indifference, certes, don't produce distress, and rash enthusiasm in good society were nothing but a moral inebriety. But Adeline was not indifferent, for, now for a commonplace, beneath the snow as a volcano holds the lava more within, etc. Shall I go on? No, I hate to hunt down a tired metaphor, so let the often used volcano go, poor thing. How frequently by me and others it hath been stirred up till its smoke quite smothers. I'll have another figure in a trice. What do you say to a bottle of champagne frozen into a very vinous ice, which leaves few drops of that immortal rain yet in the very centre, past all price? About a liquid glassful will remain, and this is stronger than the strongest grape could e'er express in its expanded shape. 'Tis the whole spirit brought to a quintessence, and thus the chilliest aspects may concentre a hidden nectar under a cold presence. And such are many, although I only meant her from whom I now deduce these moral lessons, on which the muse has always sought to enter. And your cold people are beyond all price, when once you have broken their confounded ice. But after all, they are a north-west passage unto the glowing India of the soul, and, as the good ships sent upon that message have not exactly ascertained the pole, though Parry's efforts look a lucky presage, thus gentlemen may run upon a shoal. For if the pole's not open, but all frost, a chance still, 'tis a voyage or a vessel lost. And the young beginner may as well commence with quiet cruising, or the ocean woman, while those who are not beginners should have sense enough to make for port, ere time shall summon with his grey signal flag, and the past tense, the dreary fuimus of all things human, must be declined, while life's thin threads spun out between the gaping air and gnawing gout. But heaven must be diverted. Its diversion is somewhat truculent, but never mind. The world, upon the whole, is worth the assertion, if but for comfort, that all things are kind, and that same devilish doctrine of the Persian of the two principles but leaves behind as many doubts as any other doctrine has ever puzzled faith withal, or yoked her in. The English winter, ending in July to recommence in August, now was done. 'Tis the postilion's paradise, wheels fly, on roads east, south, north, west there is a run, but for post horses who finds sympathy? Man's pities for himself or for his son, always premising that said son at college has not contracted much more debt than knowledge. The London winters ended in July, sometimes a little later. I don't err in this. Whatever other blunders lie upon my shoulders, here I must aver my muse a glass of weatherology. For Parliament is our barometer. Let radicals its other acts attack, its sessions form our only almanac. When its quicksilver's down at zero, lo, coach, chariot, luggage, baggage, equipage, wheels whirl from Carlton Palace to Soho, and happiest they who horses can engage. The turnpikes glow with dust, and Rotten Row sleeps from the chivalry of this bright age, and tradesmen with long bills and longer faces sigh as the postboys fasten on the traces. They and their bills, Arcadians both, are left to the Greek kalends of another session. Alas, to them of ready cash bereft, what hope remains? Of hope the full possession, or generous draught, conceded as a gift at a long date, till they can get a fresh one, hawked about at a discount, small or large, also the solace of an overcharge. But these are trifles. Downward flies my lord, nodding beside my lady in his carriage. Away, away, fresh horses are the word, and changed as quickly as hearts after marriage. The obsequious landlord hath the change restored. The postboys have no reason to disparage their fee, but ere the watered wheels may hiss hence, the ostler pleads too for a reminiscence. 'Tis granted, and the valet mounts the dickey, that gentleman of lords and gentlemen, also my lady's gentlewoman, tricky, tricked out, but modest more than poet's pen can paint. Così viaggino I ricchi. Excuse a foreign slip-slop now and then, but if to show I've travelled, and what's travel unless it teaches one to quote and cavil? The London winter and the country summer were well nigh over. 'Tis perhaps a pity, when nature wears the gown that doth become her, to lose those best months in a sweaty city, and wait until the nightingale grows dumber, listening to debates not very wise or witty, ere patriots their true country can remember. But there's no shooting, save grouse, till September. I've done with my tirade, the world was gone. The twice 2,000 for whom earth was made were vanish'd to be what they call alone, that is, with 30 servants for parade, as many guests or more, before whom groan as many covers duly daily laid. Let none accuse old England's hospitality, its quantity is but condensed to quality. Lord Henry and Lady Adeline departed like the rest of their compeers, the peerage, to a mansion very fine, the Gothic Babel of 1,000 years. None than themselves could boast a longer line, where time through heroes and through beauty steers, and oaks as olden as their pedigree told of their sires. A tomb in every tree. A paragraph in every paper told of their departure, such is modern fame. 'Tis pity that it takes no farther hold than an advertisement, or much the same, when, ere the ink be dry, the sound grows cold. The Morning Post was foremost to proclaim departure for his country seat to-day, Lord H. Amundeville and Lady A. We understand the splendid host intends to entertain this autumn a select and numerous party of his noble friends, midst whom we have heard from sources quite correct the Duke of D the shooting season spends, with many more by rank and fashion decked. Also a foreigner of high condition, the envoy of the secret Russian mission. And thus we see, who doubts the Morning Post, whose articles are like the 39 which those most swear to who believe them most, our gay Russ Spaniard was ordained to shine, decked by the rays reflected from his host, with those who, Pope says, greatly daring, dine. 'Tis odd but true, the last war the news abounded more with these dinners than the killed or wounded, as thus: on Thursday there was a grand dinner, present lords A, B, C, earls, dukes by name, announced with no less pomp than victory's winner. Then underneath, and in the very same column, date Falmouth. There has lately been here the Slapdash regiment, so well known to fame, whose loss in the late action we regret. The vacancies are filled up. See Gazette. To Norman Abbey whirled the noble pair, an old monastery once, and now still older mansion, of a rich and rare mixed Gothic, such as artists all allow few specimens yet left us can compare withal. It lies perhaps a little low, because the monks preferred a hill behind to shelter their devotion from the wind. It stood embosomed in a happy valley, crowned by high woodlands, where the Druid oak stood like Caractacus, in act to rally his host with broad arms against the thunderstroke, and from beneath his boughs was seen to sally the dappled foresters. As day awoke, the branching stag swept down with all his herd to quaff a brook which murmured like a bird. Before the mansion lay a lucid lake, broad as transparent, deep and freshly fed by a river, which its soften'd way did take in currents through the calmer water spread around. The wild fowl nestled in the brake, and sedges brooding in their liquid bed. The woods sloped downward to its brink, and stood with their green faces fixed upon the flood. Its outlet dash'd into a deep cascade, sparkling with foam, until again subsiding, its shriller echoes like an infant made quiet, sank into softer ripples, gliding into a rivulet, and thus allay'd pursued its course, now gleaming and now hiding its windings through the woods, now clear, now blue, according as the skies their shadows threw. A glorious remnant of the Gothic pile, while yet the church was Rome, stood half apart in a grand arch, which once screen'd many an aisle. These last had disappear'd, a loss to art. The first yet frown'd superbly o'er the soil, and kindled feelings in the roughest heart, which mourn'd the power of time's or tempest's march, in gazing on that venerable arch. Within a niche nigh to its pinnacle 12 saints had once stood sanctified in stone, but these had fallen, not when the friars fell, but in the war which struck Charles from his throne, when each house was a fortalice, as tell the annals of many a line undone. The gallant cavaliers who fought in vain for those who knew not to resign or reign. But in a higher niche, alone but crown'd, the Virgin Mother of the God-born child, with her Son in her blessed arms, look'd round, spared by some chance when all beside was spoil'd. She made the earth below seem holy ground. This may be superstition, weak or wild, but even the faintest relics of a shrine of any worship wake some thoughts divine. A mighty window, hollow in the centre, shorn of its glass of thousand colourings, through which the deepen'd glories once could enter, streaming from off the sun like seraphs' wings, now yawns all desolate. Now loud, now fainter, the gale sweeps through its fretwork, and oft sings the owl his anthem, where the silenced choir lie with their hallelujahs quench'd like fire. But in the noontide of the moon, and when the wind is winged from one point of heaven, there moans a strange unearthly sound, which then is musical, a dying accent driven through the huge arch, which soars and sinks again. Some deem it but the distant echo given back to the night wind by the waterfall, and harmonized by the old choral wall. Others, that some original shape or form, shaped by decay perchance, hath given the power, though less than that of Memnon's statue, warm in Egypt raised to harp at a fixed hour, to this grey ruin with a voice to charm. Sad but serene it sweeps o'er tree or tower, the cause I know not, nor can solve, but such the fact, I've heard it, once perhaps too much. Amidst the court a Gothic fountain play'd, symmetrical, but deck'd with carvings quaint, strange faces like to men in masquerade, and here perhaps a monster, there a saint. The spring gush'd through grim mouths of granite made, and sparkled into basins, where it spent its little torrent in 1,000 bubbles, like man's vain glory and his vainer troubles. The mansion's self was vast and venerable, with more of the monastic than has been elsewhere preserved. The cloisters still were stable, the cells too, and refectory, I ween. An exquisite small chapel had been able still unimpaired to decorate the scene. The rest had been reform'd, replaced, or sunk, and spoke more of the baron than the monk. Huge halls, long galleries, spacious chambers, joined by no quite lawful marriage of the arts, might shock a connoisseur, but when combined formed a whole in which, irregular in parts, yet left a grand impression on the mind, at least of those whose eyes are in their hearts. We gaze upon a giant for his stature, nor judge at first if all be true to nature. Steel barons, molten the next generation to silken rows of gay and garter'd earls, glanced from the walls in goodly preservation, and Lady Marys, blooming into girls, with fair long locks, had also kept their station, and countesses mature in robes and pearls, also some beauties of Sir Peter Lely, whose drapery hints we may admire them freely. Judges in very formidable ermine were there, with brows that did not much invite the accused to think their lordships would determine his cause by leaning much from might to right. Bishops who had not left a single sermon, attorneys general, awful to the sight, as hinting more, unless our judgments warp us, of the Star Chamber than of habeas corpus. Generals, some all in armour, some of the old and iron time ere lead had ta'en the lead, others in wigs of Marlborough's martial fold, huger than 12 of our degenerate breed, lordlings with staves of white or keys of gold, Nimrods whose canvas scarce contained the steed, and here and there some stern high patriot stood, who could not get the place for which he sued. But ever and anon, to soothe your vision, fatigued with these hereditary glories, there rose a Carlo Dolce, or a Titian, or wilder group of savage Salvatores. Here danced Albano's boys, and here the sea shone in Vernet's ocean lights, and there the stories of martyrs awed, as Spagnoletto tainted his brush with all the blood of all the sainted. Here sweetly spread a landscape of Lorraine, there Rembrandt made his darkness equal light, or gloomy Caravaggio's gloomier stain bronzed o'er some lean and stoic anchorite. But lo, a Teniers woos, and not in vain, your eyes to revel in a livelier sight. His bell-mouthed goblet makes me feel quite Danish, or Dutch with thirst. What ho! A flask of Rhenish! O reader, if that thou canst read, and know 'tis not enough to spell, or even to read, to constitute a reader, there must go virtues of which both you and I have need. Firstly, begin with the beginning, though that clause is hard; and secondly, proceed. Thirdly, commence not with the end, or, sinning in this sort, end at least with the beginning. But, reader, thou hast patient been of late, while I, without remorse of rhyme or fear, have built and laid out ground at such a rate, Dan Phoebus takes me for an auctioneer. That poets were so from their earliest date, by Homer's catalogue of ships is clear, but a mere modern must be moderate. I spare you, then, the furniture and the plate. The mellow autumn came, and with it came the promised party, to enjoy its sweets. The corn is cut, the manor full of game, the pointer ranges, and the sportsman beats in russet jacket. Lynx-like is his aim, full grows his bag, and wonderful his feats. Ah, nut-brown partridges! Ah, brilliant pheasants! And are ye poachers? 'Tis no sport for peasants. An English autumn, though it hath no vines blushing with bacchant coronals along the paths, o'er which the far festoon entwines the red grape in the sunny lands of song, hath yet a purchased choice of choicest wines, the claret light and the Madeira strong. If Britain mourn her bleakness, we can tell her the very best of vineyards is the cellar. Then, if she hath not that serene decline which makes the southern autumn's day appear as if 'twould to a second spring resign the season, rather than to winter drear, of indoor comforts still she hath a mine, the sea-coal fires, the earliest of the year. With outdoors too she may compete in mellow, as what is lost in green is gained in yellow. And for the effeminate villeggiatura, rife with more horns than hounds, she hath the chase, so animated that it might allure Saint from his beads to join the jocund race. Even Nimrod's self might leave the plains of Dura, and wear the Melton jacket for a space. If she hath no wild boars, she hath a tame preserve of boars, who ought to be made game. The noble guests assembled at the Abbey consisted of, we give the sex the par, the Duchess of Fitzfulke, the Countess Crabby, the ladies Silly, Boozy, Miss Eclat, Miss Bombazine, Miss Maxday, Miss O'Tabby, and Mrs. Rabbi, the rich banker's squaw. Also the Honourable Mrs. Sleep, who looked a white lamb, it was a black sheep, with other countesses of blank, but rank, at once the lee and the elite of crowds, who pass like water filter'd in a tank, all purged and pious from their native clouds, or paper turned to money by the bank. No matter how or why, the passport shrouds the passé and the past, for good society is no less famed for tolerance than piety. That is, up to a certain point, which point forms the most difficult in punctuation. Appearances appear to form the joint on which it hinges in a higher station, and so that no explosion cries, "Aroint thee, witch!" or each Medea has her Jason, or to the point with Horace and with Pulci, "Omne tulit punctum, quae miscuit utile dulci." I can't trace their rule of right, which hath a little leaning to a lottery. I've seen a virtuous woman put down quite by the mere combination of a coterie; also a so-so matron boldly fight her way back to the world by dint of plottery, and shine the very Syria of the spheres, escaping with a few slight scarless sneers. I have seen more than I'll say, but we will see how our villeggiatura will get on. The party might consist of 33 of highest caste, the Brahmins of the ton. I have named a few, not foremost in degree, but ta'en at hazard, as the rhyme may run. By way of sprinkling, scattered amongst these, there were also some Irish absentees. There was Parolles too, the legal bully, who limits all his battles to the bar and senate. When invited elsewhere, truly, he shows more appetite for words than war. There was the young bard Rackrhyme, who had newly come out and glimmer'd as a 6-week star. There was Lord Pyrrho too, the great freethinker, and Sir John Pottledeep, the mighty drinker. There was the Duke of Dash, who was a duke, ay, every inch a duke. There were 12 peers like Charlemagne's, and all such peers in look and intellect, that neither eyes nor ears for commoners had ever them mistook. There were the 6 Miss Rawbolds, pretty dears, all song and sentiment, whose hearts were set less on a convent than a coronet. Good company is a chessboard. There are kings, queens, bishops, knights, rooks, pawns. The world's a game, save that the puppets pull at their own strings. Methinks gay Punch hath something of the same. My muse, the butterfly, hath but her wings, not stings, and flits through ether without aim, alighting rarely. Were she but a hornet, perhaps there might be vices which would mourn it. I had forgotten, but must not forget, an orator, the latest of the session, who had delivered well a very set, smooth speech, his first and maidenly transgression upon debate. The papers echoed yet with his debut, which made a strong impression, and ranked with what is every day displayed, the best first speech that ever yet was made. Proud of his hear hims, proud too of his vote, and lost virginity of oratory, proud of his learning, just enough to quote, he revelled in his Ciceronian glory, with memory excellent to get by rote, with wit to hatch a pun or tell a story, graced with some merit, and with more effrontery, his country's pride. He came down to the country. There also were 2 wits by acclamation, Longbow from Ireland, Strongbow from the Tweed, both lawyers and both men of education, but Strongbow's wit was of a more polished breed. Longbow was rich in an imagination as beautiful and as bounding as a steed, but sometimes stumbling over a potato, while Strongbow's best things might have come from Cato. Strongbow was like a new-tuned harpsichord, but Longbow wild as an Aeolian harp, with which the winds of heaven can claim accord, and make a music, whether flat or sharp. Of Strongbow's talk you would not change a word; at Longbow's phrases you might sometimes carp. Both wits, one born so, and the other bred, This by his heart, his rival by his head. If all these seem a heterogeneous mass To be assembled at a country seat, Yet think a specimen of every class Is better than a humdrum tete-a-tete. The days of comedy are gone, alas, When Congreve's fool could vie with Moliere's bet. Society is smooth to that excess, That manners hardly differ more than dress. Our ridicules are kept in the background, Ridiculous enough, but also dull. Professions, too, are no more to be found Professional, and there is nought to cull Of folly's fruit; for though your fools abound, They're barren, and not worth the pains to pull. Society is now one polish'd horde, Form'd of two mighty tribes, the Bores and Bored. But from being farmers we turn gleaners, Gleaning the scanty but right well thresh'd ears of truth. And, gentle reader, when you gather meaning, You may be Boaz, and I modest Ruth. Farther I'd quote, but Scripture intervening forbids. A great impression in my youth was made by Mrs. Adams, where she cries that Scriptures out of church are blasphemize. But what we can, we glean in this vile age of chaff, Although our gleanings be not grist. I must not quite omit the talking sage Kit Cat, the famous conversationist, Who in his commonplace book had a page Prepared each morn for evenings. List, oh list! Alas, poor ghost! What unexpected woes await those who have studied their bon mots! Firstly, they must allure the conversation By many windings to their clever clinch; And secondly, must let slip no occasion, Nor abate their hearers of an inch, But take an ell, and make a great sensation If possible; and thirdly, never flinch When some smart talker puts them to the test, But seize the last word, which no doubt's the best. Lord Henry and his lady were the hosts, The party we have touch'd on were the guests. Their table was a board to tempt even ghosts To pass the Styx for more substantial feasts. I will not dwell upon the ragouts or roasts, Albeit all human history attests That happiness for man, the hungry sinner, Since Eve ate apples, much depends on dinner. Witness the lands which flow'd with milk and honey, Held out to the hungry Israelites. To this we've added since the love of money, The only sort of pleasure which requites. Youth fades, and leaves our days no longer sunny. We tire of mistresses and parasites, But oh, ambrosial cash! Ah, who would lose thee, when we no more can use, Or even abuse thee? The gentlemen got up betimes to shoot or hunt; The young because they liked the sport, The first thing boys like after play and fruit; The middle aged to make the day more short, For ennui is a growth of English root. Though nameless in our language, we retort The fact for words, and let the French translate That awful yawn which sleep cannot abate. The elderly walk through the library, And tumbled books, or criticised the pictures, Or saunter'd through the gardens piteously, And made upon the hothouse several strictures, Or rode a nag which trotted not too high, Or on the morning papers read their lectures, Or on the watch their longing eyes would fix, Longing at 60 for the hour of 6. But none were gênés. The great hour of union was rung by dinner's knell. Till then all were masters of their own time, Or in communion, or solitary, As they chose to bear the hours, which how to pass Is but to few known. Each rose up at his own, and had to spare What time he chose for dress, and broke his fast, When, where, and how he chose for that repast. The ladies, some rouged, some a little pale, met the morn as they might. If fine, they rode, or walk'd; if foul, they read or told a tale, sung or rehearsed the latest dance from abroad, discussed the fashion which might next prevail, and settled bonnets by the newest code, or cramm'd 12 sheets into one little letter, to make each correspondent a new debtor. For some had absent lovers, all had friends. The earth has nothing like a she epistle, and hardly heaven, because it never ends. I love the mystery of a female missile, which, like a creed, ne'er says all it intends, but, full of cunning as Ulysses' whistle when he allured poor Dolon, you had better take care what you reply to such a letter. Then there were billiards, cards too, but no dice, save in the clubs no man of honour plays. Boats when 'twas water, skating when 'twas ice, and the hard frost destroyed the scenting days. And angling too, that solitary vice, whatever Isaac Walton sings or says. The quaint old cruel coxcomb, his gullet should have a hook, and a small trout to pull it. With evening came the banquet and the wine, the conversazione, the duet, attuned by voices more or less divine. My heart or head aches with the memory yet. The 4 Miss Rawbolds in a glee would shine, but the 2 youngest loved more to be set down to the harp, because to music's charms they added graceful necks, white hands, and arms. Sometimes a dance, though rarely on field days, for then the gentlemen were rather tired, displayed some sylph-like figures in its maze. Then there was small talk ready when required, flirtation but decorous, the mere praise of charms that should or should not be admired. The hunters fought their fox hunt o'er again, and then retreated soberly at 10. The politicians in a nook apart discussed the world, and settled all the spheres. The wits watch'd every loophole for their art to introduce a bon mot head and ears. Small is the rest of those who would be smart. A moment's good thing may have cost them years before they find an hour to introduce it, and even then some bore may make them lose it. But all was gentle and aristocratic in this our party, polished, smooth, and cold, as Phidian forms cut out of marble Attic. There now are no squire westerns as of old, and our sapphires are not so emphatic, but fair as then, or fairer to behold. We have no accomplished blackguards like Tom Jones, but gentlemen in stays, as stiff as stones. They separated at an early hour, that is, ere midnight, which is London's noon. But in the country ladies seek their bower a little earlier than the waning moon. Peace to the slumbers of each folded flower! May the rose call back its true colour soon. Good hours of fair cheeks are the fairest tinters, and lower the price of rouge, at least some winters. End of Canto 13 of Don Juan by Gordon Lord Byron. Canto 14 of Don Juan by Gordon Lord Byron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Peter Gallagher. If from great natures or our own abyss of thought we could but snatch a certainty, perhaps mankind might find the path they miss. But then 'twould spoil much good philosophy. One system eats another up, and this much as old Saturn ate his progeny. For when his pious consort gave him stones in lieu of sons, of these he made no bones. But system doth reverse the Titan's breakfast, and eats her parents, albeit the digestion is difficult. Pray tell me, can you make fast, after due search, your faith to any question? Look back o'er ages, ere unto the stake fast you bind yourself, and call some mode the best one. Nothing more true than not to trust your senses, and yet what are your other evidences? For me, I know naught. Nothing I deny, admit, reject, contemn. And what know you? Except perhaps that you were born to die, and both may after all turn out untrue. An age may come, font of eternity, when nothing shall be either old or new. Death, so called, is a thing which makes men weep, and yet a third of life is passed in sleep. A sleep without dreams after a rough day of toil is what we covet most, and yet how clay shrinks back from more quiescent clay! The very suicide that pays his debt at once without instalments, an old way of paying debts which creditors regret, lets out impatiently his rushing breath, less from disgust of life than dread of death. 'Tis round him, near him, here, there, everywhere, and there's a courage which grows out of fear, perhaps of all most desperate, which will dare, the worst to know it, when the mountains rear their peaks beneath your human foot, and there you look down o'er the precipice, and drear the gulf of rock yawns, you can't gaze a minute without an awful wish to plunge within it. 'Tis true you don't, but pale and struck with terror retire. But look into your past impression, and you will find, though shuddering at the mirror of your own thoughts, in all their self-confession the lurking bias, be it truth or error, to the unknown, a secret prepossession to plunge with all your fear. But where? You know not, and that's the reason why you'd or do not. But what's this to the purpose, you will say? Gentle reader, nothing, a mere speculation, for which my sole excuse is, 'tis my way. Sometimes with, and sometimes without occasion, I write what's uppermost, without delay. This narrative is not meant for narration, but a mere airy and fantastic basis to build up common things with commonplaces. You know, or don't know, that great Bacon saith, "Fling up a straw, 'twill show the way the wind blows." And such a straw, borne on by human breath, is poesy, according as the mind glows. A paper kite which flies 'twixt life and death, a shadow which the onward soul behind throws, and mine's a bubble, not blown up for praise, but just to play with, as an infant plays. The world is all before me, or behind, for I have seen a portion of that same, and quite enough for me to keep in mind. Of passions too I have proved enough to blame, to the great pleasure of our friends mankind, who like to mix some slight alloy with fame. For I was rather famous in my time, until I fairly knock'd it up with rhyme. I have brought this world about my ears, and eke the other, that's to say, the clergy, who upon my head have bid their thunders break in pious libels by no means few. And yet I can't help scribbling once a week, tiring old readers, nor discovering new. In youth I wrote because my mind was full, and now because I find it growing dull. But why then publish? There are no rewards of fame or profit when the world grows weary. I ask in turn, why do you play at cards? Why drink? Why read? To make some hour less dreary. It occupies me to turn back regards on what I've seen, or ponder'd, sad or cheery. and what I write I cast upon the stream to swim or sink. I have had at least my dream. I think that were I certain of success, I hardly could compose another line. So long I've battled, either more or less, that no defeat can drive me from the nine. This feeling 'tis not easy to express, and yet 'tis not affected, I opine. In play there are two pleasures for your choosing: the one is winning, and the other losing. Besides, my muse by no means deals in fiction. She gathers a repertory of facts, of course with some reserve and slight restriction, but mostly sings of human things and acts, and that's one cause she meets with contradiction. For too much truth at first sight ne'er attracts, and were her object only what's called glory, with more ease too she'd tell a different story. Love, war, a tempest, surely there's variety, also a seasoning slight of lucubration, a bird's eye view too of that wild society, a slight glance thrown on men of every station. If you have nought else, here's at least satiety, both in performance and in preparation. And though these lines should only line portmanteaus, trade will be all the better for these cantos. The portion of this world which I at present have taken up to fill the following sermon is one of which there's no description recent. The reason why is easy to determine. Although it seems both prominent and pleasant, there is a sameness in its gems and ermine, a dull and family likeness through all ages, of no great promise for poetic pages. With much to excite, there's little to exalt. Nothing that speaks to all men and all times, a sort of varnish over every fault, a kind of commonplace even in their crimes. Factitious passions, wit without much salt, a want of that true nature which sublimes whate'er it shows with truth, a smooth monotony of character, in those at least who've got any. Sometimes, indeed, like soldiers off parade, they break their ranks and gladly leave the drill. But then the roll call draws them back, afraid. They must be or seem what they were. Still, doubtless, it is a brilliant masquerade. But when of the first sight you have had your fill, it palls. At least it did so upon me, this paradise of pleasure and ennui. When we have made our love and gamed our gaming, dress'd, voted, shown, and maybe something more, with dandies dined, heard senators declaiming, seen beauties brought to market by the score, sad rakes to sadder husbands chastely taming, there's little left but to be bored or bore. Witness those ci devant jeunes hommes who stem the stream, nor leave the world which leaveth them. 'Tis said, indeed a general complaint, that no one has succeeded in describing the monde exactly as they ought to paint. Some say the authors only snatch, by bribing the porter, some slight scandals, strange and quaint, to furnish matter for their moral gibing, and that their books have but one style in common: my lady's prattle, filter'd through her woman. But this can't well be true just now, for writers are grown of the beau monde a part potential. I've seen them balance even the scale with fighters, especially when young, for that's essential. Why do their sketches fail them as inditers of what they deem themselves most consequential, the real portrait of the highest tribe? 'Tis that, in fact, there's little to describe. Haud ignara loquor, these are nugae, quarum pars parva fui, but still art and part. Now I could much more easily sketch a harem, a battle, wreck, or history of the heart than these things; and besides, I wish to spare 'em, for reasons which I choose to keep apart. Vetabo carreris sacrum qui vulgarit, which means that vulgar people must not share it; and therefore what I throw off is ideal, lower'd, leaven'd, like a history of Freemasons, which bears the same relation to the real as Captain Parry's voyage may do to Jason's. The grand arcanum's not for men to see all. My music has some mystic diapasons, and there is much which could not be appreciated in any manner by the uninitiated. Alas, worlds fall, and woman, since she fell'd the world, as since that history less polite than true has been a creed so strictly held, has not yet given up the practice quite. Poor thing of usages, coerced, compell'd, victim when wrong, and martyr oft when right, condemn'd to childbed, as men for their sins have shaving too entailed upon their chins, a daily plague, which in the aggregate may average on the whole with parturition. But as to women, who can penetrate the real sufferings of their she condition? Man's very sympathy with their estate has much of selfishness, and more suspicion. Their love, their virtue, beauty, education, but form good housekeepers to breed a nation. All this were very well, and can't be better, but even this is difficult, heaven knows. So many troubles from her birth beset her, such small distinction between friends and foes, the gilding wears so soon from off her fetter, that but ask any woman if she'd choose, take her at 30, that is, to have been female or male, a schoolboy or a queen. Petticoat influence is a great reproach, which even those who obey would fain be thought to fly from, as from hungry pikes a roach. But since beneath it upon earth we are bought by various joltings of life's hackney coach, I for one venerate a petticoat, a garment of mystical sublimity, no matter whether russet, silk, or dimity. Much I respect, and much I have adored in my young days that chaste and goodly veil, which holds a treasure like a miser's hoard, and more attracts by all it doth conceal. A golden scabbard on a damask sword, a loving letter with a mystic seal, a cure for grief. For what can ever rankle before a petticoat and peeping ankle? And when upon a silent, sullen day, with a sirocco, for example, blowing, when even the sea looks dim with all its spray, and sulkily the river's ripple flowing, and the sky shows that very ancient grey, the sober, sad antithesis to glowing, 'tis pleasant, if then anything is pleasant, to catch a glimpse even of a pretty peasant. We left our heroes and our heroines in that fair clime which don't depend on climate, quite independent of the zodiac signs, though certainly more difficult to rhyme at, because the sun and stars and aught that shines, mountains and all we can be most sublime at, are there oft dull, and dreary as a dun, whether a sky's or tradesman's is all one. An indoor life is less poetical. An out-of-door hath showers and mists and sleet, with which I could not brew a pastoral, but, be it as it may, a bard must meet all difficulties, whether great or small, to spoil his undertaking or complete, and work away like spirit upon matter, embarrassed somewhat both with fire and water. Juan, in this respect at least, like saints, was all things unto people of all sorts, and lived contentedly, without complaints, in camps, in ships, in cottages or courts, born with that happy soul which seldom faints, and mingling modesty in toil or sports, he likewise could be most things to all women, without the coxcombry of certain she-men. A fox hunt to a foreigner is strange. 'Tis also subject to the double danger of tumbling first, and having in exchange some pleasant jesting at the awkward stranger. But Juan had been early taught to range the wilds as doth an Arab turn'd avenger, so that his horse, or charger, hunter, hack, knew that he had a rider on his back. And now in this new field with some applause he clear'd hedge, ditch, and double post and rail, and never craned, and made but few faux pas, and only fretted when the scent 'gan fail. He broke, 'tis true, some statutes of the laws of hunting, for the sagest youth is frail; rode all the hounds, it may be, now and then, and once saw several country gentlemen; but on the whole, to general admiration, he acquitted both himself and horse. The squires marvelled at merit of another nation; the boors cried, "Dang it, who'd have thought?" Sires, the nesters of the sporting generation, swore praises, and recalled their former fires. The huntsman's self relented to a grin, and rated him almost a whipper-in. Such were his trophies, not of spear and shield, but leaps and bursts, and sometimes foxes' brushes. Yet I must own, although in this I yield to patriot sympathy, a Briton's blushes, he thought at heart like courtly Chesterfield, who, after a long chase o'er hills, dales, bushes, and what not, though he rode beyond all price, asked next day if men ever hunted twice. He also had a quality uncommon to early risers after a long chase, who wake in winter ere the cock can summon December's drowsy day to his dull race; a quality agreeable to women when her soft liquid words run on apace, who likes a listener, whether saint or sinner. He did not fall asleep just after dinner, but light and airy stood on the alert, and shone in the best part of dialogue, by humouring always what they might assert, and listening to the topics most in vogue; now grave, now gay, but never dull or pert, and smiling but in secret, cunning rogue, he ne'er presumed to make an error clearer. In short, there never was a better hearer. And then he danced. All foreigners excel the serious angles in the eloquence of pantomime. He danced, I say, right well, with emphasis, and also with good sense, a thing in footing indispensable. He danced without theatrical pretence, not like a ballet master in the van of his drill'd nymphs, but like a gentleman. Chaste were his steps, kept within due bound, and eloquence was sprinkled o'er his figure. Like swift Camilla, he scarce skimmed the ground, and rather held in than put forth his vigour. And then he had an ear for music's sound, which might defy a crotchet critic's rigour. Such classic pas, sans flaw, set off our hero. He danced like a personified bolero, or like a flying hour before Aurora in Guido's famous fresco, which alone is worth a tour to Rome, although no more a remnant were there of the old world's sole throne. The tout ensemble of his movements wore a grace of the soft ideal, seldom shown, and ne'er to be described, for to the dolour of bards and prosers, words are void of colour. No marvel then he was a favourite, a full-grown Cupid very much admired, a little spoiled, but by no means so quite; at least he kept his vanity retired. Such was his tact, he could alike delight the chaste and those who are not so much inspired. The Duchess of Fitzfulk, who loved tracasserie, began to treat him with some small agasserie. She was a fine and somewhat full-blown blonde, desirable, distinguish'd, celebrated for several winters in the grand monde. I'd rather not say what might be related of her exploits, for this were ticklish ground. Besides, there might be falsehood in what's stated. Her late performance had been a dead set at Lord Augustus Fitz-Plantagenet. This noble personage began to look a little black upon this new flirtation. But such small licences must lovers brook, mere freedoms of the female corporation. Woe to the man who ventures a rebuke, 'twill but precipitate a situation extremely disagreeable, but common to calculators when they count on woman. The circle smiled, then whisper'd, and then sneer'd. The misses bridled, and the matrons frown'd. Some hoped things might not turn out as they fear'd. Some would not deem such women could be found. Some ne'er believed one half of what they heard. Some look'd perplexed, and others look'd profound, And several pitied with sincere regret Poor Lord Augustus Fitz Plantagenet. But what is odd, none ever named the Duke, Who, one might think, was something in the affair. True, he was absent, and 'twas rumour'd took But small concern about the when or where Of what his consort did. If he could brook her gaieties, none had a right to stare. Theirs was that best of unions, past all doubt, Which never meets, and therefore can't fall out. But oh, that I should ever pen so sad a line! Fired with an abstract love of virtue, she, my Dian of the Ephesians, Lady Adeline, began to think the Duchess's conduct free, regretting much that she had chosen so bad a line, And, waxing chiller in her courtesy, look'd grave and pale to see her friend's fragility, For which most friends reserve their sensibility. There's nought in this bad world like sympathy, 'Tis so becoming to the soul and face, Sets to soft music the harmonious sigh, And robes sweet friendship in a Brussels lace. Without a friendship, what were humanity, To hunt our errors up with a good grace, Consoling us with, "Would you had thought twice! Ah, if you had but follow'd my advice!" Oh, Job, you had two friends: one's quite enough, Especially when we are ill at ease. They are but bad pilots when the weather's rough, Doctors less famous for their cures than fees. Let no man grumble when his friends fall off, As they will do, like leaves at the first breeze. When your affairs come round, one way or t'other, Go to the coffee house and take another. But this is not my maxim: had it been, Some heartaches had been spared me. Yet I care not. I would not be a tortoise in his screen Of stubborn shell, which waves and weather wear not. 'Tis better on the whole to have felt and seen That which humanity may bear, or bear not. 'Twill teach discernment to the sensitive, And not to pour their ocean in a sieve. Of all the horrid, hideous notes of woe, Sadder than owl songs or the midnight blast Is that portentous phrase, "I told you so," Utter'd by friends, those prophets of the past, Who, 'stead of saying what you now should do, Own they foresaw that you would fall at last, And solace your slight lapse 'gainst bonus mores With a long memorandum of old stories. The Lady Adeline's serene severity Was not confined to feeling for her friend, Whose fame she rather doubted with posterity, Unless her habits should begin to mend. But Juan also shared in her austerity, But mix'd with pity, pure as e'er was penn'd. His inexperience moved her gentle ruth, And, as her junior by 6 weeks, his youth. These 40 days' advantage of her years, And hers were those which can face calculation, Boldly referring to the list of peers And noble births, nor dread the enumeration, Gave her a right to have maternal fears For a young gentleman's fit education, Though she was far from that leap year, whose leap In female dates strikes time all of a heap. This may be fix'd at somewhere before 30, Say 7 and 20, for I never knew The strictest in chronology and virtue Advance beyond, while they could pass for new. O Time, why dost not pause? Thy scythe, so dirty with rust, Should surely cease to hack and hew. Reset it, shave more smoothly, also slower, If but to keep thy credit as a mower. But Adeline was far from that ripe age Whose ripeness is but bitter at the best. 'Twas rather her experience made her sage, For she had seen the world and stood its test. As I have said I forget what page, My muse despises reference, as you've guess'd by this time, But Strike 6 from 7 and 20, and you will find her sum of years in plenty. At 16 she came out, presented, vaunted, she put all coronets into commotion. At 17, too, the world was still enchanted with the new Venus of their brilliant ocean. At 18, though below her feet still panted a hecatomb of suitors with devotion, she had consented to create again that Adam called the happiest of men. Since then she had sparkled through 3 glowing winters, admired, adored, but also so correct that she had puzzled all the acutest hinters without the apparel of being circumspect. They could not even glean the slightest splinters from off the marble, which had no defect. She had also snatched a moment since her marriage to bear a son and heir, and 1 miscarriage. Fondly the wheeling fireflies flew around her, those little glitterers of the London night, but none of these possessed a sting to wound her. She was a pitch beyond a coxcomb's flight. Perhaps she wished an aspirant profounder, but whatsoe'er she wished, she acted right. And whether coldness, pride, or virtue dignify, a woman, so she's good, what does it signify? I hate a motive, like a lingering bottle with which the landlord makes too long a stand, leaving all claretless the unmoistened throttle, especially with politics on hand. I hate it, as I hate a drove of cattle who whirl the dust as simoons whirl the sand. I hate it, as I hate an argument, a laureate's ode, or servile peer's content. 'Tis sad to hack into the roots of things, they are so much intertwisted with the earth. So that the branch a goodly verdure flings, I reck not if an acorn gave it birth. To trace all actions to their secret springs Would make indeed some melancholy mirth, But this is not at present my concern, And I refer you to wise Oxenstern. With the kind view of saving an eclat, Both to the Duchess and diplomatist, The Lady Adeline, as soon as she saw that Juan was unlikely to resist— for foreigners don't know that a faux pas in England ranks quite on a different list from those of other lands, unblessed with juries, whose verdict for such sin a certain cure is— the Lady Adeline resolved to take such measures as she thought might best impede the farther progress of this sad mistake. She thought with some simplicity indeed, but innocence is bold, even at the stake, and simple in the world, and doth not need nor use those palisades by dames erected, whose virtue lies in never being detected. It was not that she feared the very worst. His Grace was an enduring married man, and was not likely all at once to burst into a scene, and swell the client's clan of Doctors' Commons. But she dreaded first the magic of her Grace's talisman, and next a quarrel, as he'd seemed to fret, with Lord Augustus Fitz Plantagenet. Her Grace, too, passed for being an intrigante, and somewhat méchante in her amorous sphere, one of those pretty, precious plagues which haunt a lover with caprices soft and dear, that like to make a quarrel when they can't find one each day of the delightful year, bewitching, torturing as they freeze or glow, and, what is worst of all, won't let you go. The sort of thing to turn a young man's head, or make a werter of him in the end. No wonder then a purer soul should dread this sort of chaste liaison for a friend. It were much better to be wed or dead, than wear a heart a woman loves to rend. 'Tis best to pause and think ere you rush on, if that a bonne fortune be really bonne. And first, in the overflowing of her heart, which really knew, or thought it knew, no guile, she called her husband now and then apart, and bade him counsel Juan. With a smile Lord Henry heard her plans of artless art to wean Don Juan from the siren's wile, and answer'd like a statesman or a prophet, in such a guise that she could make nothing of it. Firstly, he said he never interfered in anybody's business but the king's. Next, that he never judged from what appeared without strong reason of those sorts of things. Thirdly, that Juan had more brain than beard, and was not to be held in leading strings. And fourthly, what need hardly be said twice, that good but rarely comes from good advice. And therefore, doubtless to approve the truth of the last axiom, he advised his spouse to leave the parties to themselves, forsooth, at least as far as bienséance allows. That time would temper Juan's faults of youth, that young men rarely made monastic vows, that opposition only more attaches. But here a messenger brought in despatches, and being of the council called the Privy, Lord Henry walked into his cabinet, to furnish matter for some future Livy to tell how he reduced the nation's debt. And if their full contents I do not give ye, it is because I do not know them yet. But I shall add them in a brief appendix, to come between mine epic and its index. But ere he went, he added a slight hint, another gentle commonplace or two, such as are coined in conversation's mint, and pass for want of better, though not new. Then he broke his packet to see what 'twas in it, and having casually glanced it through, retired, and as went out, calmly kiss'd her, less like a young wife than an aged sister. He was a cold, good, honourable man, proud of his birth, and proud of everything. A goodly spirit for a state divan, a figure fit to walk before a king, tall, stately, formed to lead the courtly van on birthdays, glorious with a star and string, the very model of a chamberlain, and such I mean to make him when I reign. But there was something wanting on the whole, I don't know what, and therefore cannot tell, which pretty women, the sweet souls, call soul. Certes it was not body, he was well proportion'd as a poplar or a pole, a handsome man, that human miracle, and in each circumstance of love or war had still preserved his perpendicular. Still there was something wanting, as I've said, that undefinable je ne sais quoi, which, for what I know, may of yore have led to Homer's Iliad, since it drew to Troy the Greek Eve, Helen, from the Spartan's bed. Though on the whole, no doubt the Dardan boy was much inferior to King Menelaus. But thus it is, some women will betray us. There is an awkward thing which much perplexes, unless, like wise Tiresias, we had proved by turns the difference of the several sexes. Neither can show quite how they would be loved. The sensual for a short time but connects us, the sentimental boasts to be unmoved, but both together form a kind of centaur, upon whose back 'tis better not to venture. A something all-sufficient for the heart is that for which the sex are always seeking, but how to fill up that same vacant part? There lies the rub, and this they are but weak in. Frail mariners afloat without a chart, they run before the wind through high seas breaking, and when they have made the shore through every shock, 'tis odd, or odds, it may turn out a rock. There is a flower called love in idleness, for which see Shakespeare's ever-blooming garden. I will not make his great description less, and beg his British godship's humble pardon, if in my extremity of rhyme's distress I touch a single leaf where he is warden. But though the flower is different, with the French or Swiss Rousseau cry, Voilà la pervenche. Eureka! I have found it. What I mean to say is not that love is idleness, but that in love such idleness has been an accessory, as I have cause to guess. Hard labours and indifferent go between. Your men of business are not apt to express much passion, since the merchant ship, the Argo, conveyed Medea as her supercargo. Beatus ille procul, from Negotiis, saith Horace. The great little poet's wrong. His other maxim, noscitur a sociis, is much more to the purpose of his song, though even that were sometimes too ferocious, unless good company be kept too long. But in his teeth, whate'er their state or station, thrice happy they who have an occupation. Adam exchanged his paradise for ploughing. Eve made up millinery with fig leaves. the earliest knowledge from the tree so knowing, as far as I know, that the church receives. And since that time it need not cost much showing that many of the ills o'er which man grieves, and still more women, spring from not employing some hours to make the remnant worth enjoying. And hence high life is oft a dreary void, a rack of pleasures where we must invent a something wherewithal to be annoyed. Bards may sing what they please about content. Contented, when translated, means but cloyed, and hence arise the woes of sentiment, blue devils and blue stockings and romances reduced to practice, and performed like dances. I do declare upon an affidavit, romances I ne'er read like those I've seen, nor if unto the world I ever gave it, would some believe that such a tale had been, but such intent I never had nor have it. Some truths are better kept behind a screen, especially when they would look like lies. I therefore deal in generalities. An oyster may be cross'd in love, and why? Because he mopeth idly in his shell, and heaves a lonely subterraqueous sigh, much as a monk may do within his cell. And apropos of monks, their piety with sloth hath found it difficult to dwell. Those vegetables of the Catholic creed are apt exceedingly to run to seed. O Wilberforce, thou man of black renown, whose merit none enough can sing or say, thou hast struck one immense colossus down, thou moral Washington of Africa, but there's another little thing I own which you should perpetrate some summer's day, and set the other half of earth to rights. You have freed the blacks, now pray shut up the whites. Shut up the bald coot bully Alexander, ship off the Holy Three to Senegal, teach them that sauce for goose is sauce for gander, and ask them how they like to be in thrall. Shut up each high heroic salamander, who eats fire gratis, since the pay's but small. Shut up, no, not the king, but the pavilion, or else 'twill cost us all another million. Shut up the world at large, let Bedlam out, and you will be perhaps surprised to find all things pursue exactly the same route as now with those of soi-disant sound mind. This I could prove beyond a single doubt, were there a jot of sense among mankind, but till that point d'appui is found, alas, like Archimedes, I leave the earth as 'twas. Our gentle Adeline had one defect: her heart was vacant, though a splendid mansion. Her conduct had been perfectly correct, as she had seen nought claiming its expansion. A wavering spirit may be easier wrecked, because 'tis frailer, doubtless, than a staunch one, but when the latter works its own undoing, its inner crash is like an earthquake's ruin. She loved her lord, or thought so, but that love cost her an effort, which is a sad toil, the stone of Sisyphus, if once we move our feelings 'gainst the nature of the soil. She had nothing to complain of or reprove, no bickerings, no connubial turmoil. Their union was a model to behold, serene and noble, conjugal but cold. There was no great disparity of years, though much in temper, but they never clashed. They moved like stars united in their spheres, or like the Rhone by Leman's water wash'd, where mingled yet separate appears the river from the lake, all bluely dash'd through the serene and placid glassy deep, which fain would lull its river child to sleep. Now when she once had ta'en an interest in anything, however she might flatter herself that her intentions were the best, intense intentions are a dangerous matter. Impressions were much stronger than she guess'd, and gathered as they run like growing water upon her mind, and the more so as her breast was not at first too readily impressed. But when it was, she had that lurking demon of double nature, and thus doubly named, firmness yclept in heroes, kings, and seamen, that is, when they succeed, but greatly blamed as obstinacy, both in men and women, whene'er their triumph pales or star is tamed. And 'twill perplex the casuist in morality to fix the due bounds of this dangerous quality. Had Bonaparte won at Waterloo, it had been firmness; now 'tis pertinacity. Must the event decide between the two? I leave it to your people of sagacity to draw the line between the false and true, if such can e'er be drawn by man's capacity. My business is with Lady Adeline, who in her way too was a heroine. She knew not her own heart, then how should I? I think not she was then in love with Juan; if so, she would have had the strength to fly the wild sensation, unto her a new one. She merely felt a common sympathy, I will not say it was a false or true one, in him, because she thought he was in danger. Her husband's friend, her own, young and a stranger. She was, or thought she was, his friend, and this without the farce of friendship or romance of Platonism, which so often leads amiss ladies who've studied friendship but in France or Germany, where people purely kiss. To thus much Adeline would not advance, but of such friendship as man's made to man be, she was as capable as woman can be. No doubt the secret influence of the sex will there, as also in the ties of blood, an innocent predominance annex, and tune the concord to a finer mood. If free from passion, which all friendship checks, and your true feelings fully understood, no friend like to a woman earth discovers, so that you have not been, nor will be lovers. Love bears within its breast the very germ of change, and how should this be otherwise? That violent things more quickly find a term is shown through nature's whole analogies, and how should the most fierce of all be firm? Would you have endless lightning in the skies? Methinks love's very title says enough. How should the tender passion e'er be tough? Alas, by all experience, seldom yet, I merely quote what I have heard from many, had lovers not some reason to regret the passion which made Solomon a zany. I've also seen some wives, not to forget the marriage state, the best or worst of any, who were the very paragon of wives, yet made the misery of at least 2 lives. I've also seen some female friends, 'tis odd but true, as if expedient I could prove, that faithful were through thick and thin, abroad, at home, far more than ever yet was love, who did not quit me when oppression trod upon me, whom no scandal could remove, who fought and fight in absence too my battles, despite the snake society's loud rattles. Whether Don Juan and chaste Adeline grew friends in this or any other sense, will be discussed hereafter, I opine. At present I'm glad of a pretence to leave them hovering, as the effect is fine, and keeps the atrocious reader in suspense. The surest way for ladies and for books to bait their tender or their tenter hooks. Whether they rode or walked or studied Spanish to read Don Quixote in the original, a pleasure before which all others vanish; whether their talk was of the kind called small or serious, are topics I must banish to the next canto, where perhaps I shall say something to the purpose, and display considerable talent in my way. Above all, I beg all men to forbear anticipating aught about the matter. They'll only make mistakes about the fair, and Juan too, especially the latter, and I shall take a much more serious air than I have yet done in this epic satire. It is not clear that Adeline and Juan will fall, but if they do, 'twill be their ruin. But great things spring from little. Would you think that in our youth as dangerous a passion as e'er brought man and woman to the brink of ruin rose from such a slight occasion, as few would ever dream could form the link of such a sentimental situation? You'll never guess. I bet you millions, milliards. It all sprung from a harmless game at billiards. 'Tis strange, but true; for truth is always strange, stranger than fiction. If it could be told, how much would novels gain by the exchange? How differently the world would men behold! How oft would vice and virtue places change! The new world would be nothing to the old, If some Columbus of the moral seas Would show mankind their soul's antipodes. What antras vast and deserts idle then Would be discover'd in the human soul! What icebergs in the hearts of mighty men, With self-love in the centre as their pole! What anthropophagi, and 9 of 10 Of those who hold the kingdoms in control, Were things but only call'd by their right name, Caesar himself would be ashamed of fame. End of Canto 14 of Don Juan, by Gordon Lord Byron. Canto 15 of Don Juan, by Gordon Lord Byron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Peter Gallagher. What should follow slips from my reflection. Whatever follows, nevertheless may be as apropos of hope or retrospection as though the lurking thought had followed free. All life is but an interjection, an oh or ah of joy or misery, or ha ha or bah, or a yawn or pooh, of which perhaps the latter is most true. But more or less the whole's a syncope or a singletus, emblems of emotion, the grand antithesis to ennui, wherewith we break our bubbles on the ocean, that watery outline of eternity, or miniature at least, as is my notion, which ministers unto the soul's delight in seeing matters which are out of sight. But all are better than the sigh suppress'd, corroding in the cavern of the heart, making the countenance a mask of rest, and turning human nature to an art. Few men dare show their thoughts of worst or best. Dissimulation always sets apart a corner for herself, and therefore fiction is that which passes with least contradiction. Who can tell, or rather who cannot remember without telling, passion's errors? The drainer of oblivion, even the sot, hath got blue devils for his morning mirrors. What though on Lethe's stream he seems to float, he cannot sink his tremors or his terrors. The ruby glass that shakes within his hand leaves a sad sentiment of time's worst sand. And as for love, love, we will proceed. The Lady Adeline Amundeville, a pretty name as one would wish to read, must perch harmonious on my tuneful quill. There's music in the sighing of a reed, there's music in the gushing of a rill, there's music in all things, if men had ears. Their earth is but an echo of the spheres. The Lady Adeline, right honourable and honoured, ran a risk of growing less so, for few of the soft sex are very stable in their resolves. Alas, that I should say so! They differ as wine differs from its label when once decanted. I presume to guess so, but will not swear, yet both upon occasion till old may undergo adulteration. But Adeline was of the purest vintage, the unmingled essence of the grape, and yet bright as a new Napoleon from its mintage, or glorious as a diamond richly set. A page where time should hesitate to print age, and for which nature might forgo her debt. Sole creditor whose process doth involve in't the luck of finding everybody solvent. O death, thou dunnest of all duns! Thou daily knockest at doors, at first with modest tap, like a meek tradesman, when, approaching palely some splendid debtor he would take by sap. But oft denied, as patience 'gins to fail, he advances with exasperated rap, and, if let in, insists in terms unhandsome on ready money, or a draft on ransom. Whate'er thou takest, spare awhile poor beauty. She is so rare, and thou hast so much prey. What though she now and then may slip from duty, the more's the reason why you ought to stay. gaunt gourmand, with whole nations for your booty, you should be civil in a modest way. Suppress then some slight feminine diseases, and take as many heroes as heaven pleases. Fair Adeline, the more ingenuous where she was interested, as was said, because she was not apt, like some of us, to like too readily, or too high bred to show it, points we need not now discuss, would give up artlessly both heart and head unto such feelings as seemed innocent, for objects worthy of the sentiment. Some parts of Juan's history, which rumour, that live gazette, had scatter'd to disfigure, she had heard. But women hear with more good humour such aberrations than we men of rigour. Besides, his conduct since in England grew more strict, and his mind assumed a manlier vigour, because he had, like Alcibiades, the art of living in all climes with ease. His manner was perhaps the more seductive, because he ne'er seem'd anxious to seduce. Nothing affected, studied, or constructive of coxcombry or conquest. No abuse of his attractions marr'd the fair perspective, to indicate a Cupidon broke loose, and seem'd to say, "Resist us if you can," which makes a dandy, while it spoils a man. They are wrong, that's not the way to set about it, as, if they told the truth, could well be shown. But right or wrong, Don Juan was without it. In fact, his manner was his alone. Sincere he was, at least you could not doubt it, in listening merely to his voice's tone. The devil hath not in all his quivers choice an arrow for the heart, like a sweet voice. By nature soft, his whole address held off suspicion. Though not timid, his regard was such as rather seem'd to keep aloof, to shield himself, than put you on your guard. Perhaps 'twas hardly quite assured enough, but modesty's at time its own reward, like virtue, and the absence of pretension will go much farther than there's need to mention. Serene, accomplished, cheerful, but not loud, insinuating without insinuation, observant of the foibles of the crowd, yet ne'er betraying this in conversation, proud with the proud, yet courteously proud, so as to make them feel he knew his station and theirs. Without a struggle for priority, he neither brooked nor claimed superiority. That is, with men. With women he was what they pleased to make or take him for, and their imagination's quite enough for that, so that the outlines tolerably fair, they fill the canvas up, and verbum sat. If once their fantasies be brought to bear upon an object, whether sad or playful, they can transfigure brighter than a Raphael. Adeline, no deep judge of character, was apt to add a colouring from her own. 'Tis thus the good will amiably err, and eke the wise, as often has been shown. Experience is the chief philosopher, but saddest when his science is well known, and persecuted sages teach the schools their folly in forgetting there are fools. Was it not so, great Locke, and greater Bacon, great Socrates? And thou divinest still, whose lot it is by man to be mistaken, and thy pure creed made sanction of all ill? Redeeming worlds to be by bigots shaken, how was thy toil rewarded? We might fill volumes with similar sad illustrations, but leave them to the conscience of the nations. I perch upon an humbler promontory, amidst life's infinite variety, with no great care for what is nicknamed glory, but speculating as I cast mine eye on what may suit or may not suit my story, and never straining hard to versify, I rattle on exactly as I'd talk with anybody in a ride or walk. I don't know that there may be much ability shown in this sort of desultory rhyme, but there's a conversational facility which may round off an hour upon a time. Of this I'm sure at least, there's no civility in mine irregularity of chime, which rings what's uppermost of new or hoary, just as I feel the improvisatori. Omnia vult belle mato dicere, dic aliquando et bene, dic neutrum, dic aliquando male. The first is rather more than mortal can do, the second may be sadly done, or gaily, the third is still more difficult to stand to, and the fourth we hear and see and say too daily. The whole together is what I could wish to serve in this conundrum of a dish. A modest hope, but modesty's my forte, and pride my feeble. Let us ramble on. I meant to make this poem very short, but now I can't tell where it may not run. No doubt, if I had wished to pay my court to critics, or to hail the setting sun of tyranny of all kinds, my concision were more. But I was born for opposition. But then 'tis mostly on the weaker side, so that I verily believe if they who now are basking in their full-blown pride were shaken down, and dogs had had their day, though at the first I might perchance deride their tumble, I should turn the other way, and wax an ultra-royalist in loyalty, because I hate even democratic royalty. I think I should have made a decent spouse, if I had never proved the soft condition. I think I should have made monastic vows, but for my own peculiar superstition. 'Gainst rhyme I never should have knock'd my brows, nor broken my own head, nor that of Priscian, nor worn the motley mantle of a poet, if some one had not told me to forego it. But laissez aller. Knights and dames I sing such as the time may furnish. 'Tis a flight which seems at first to need no lofty wing, plumed by Longinus or the Stagyrite. The difficulty lies in colouring, keeping the due proportion still in sight, with nature manners which are artificial, and rendering general that which is especial. The difference is, that in the days of old men made the manners. Manners now make men, pinned like a flock, and fleeced too in their fold, at least 9, and a 9th beside of 10. Now this at all events must render cold your writers, who must either draw again days better drawn before, or else assume the present with their commonplace costume. We'll do our best to make the best on't. March, march, my muse, if you cannot fly, yet flutter. And when you may not be sublime, be arch, or starch, as are the edicts statesmen utter. We surely may find something worth research. Columbus found a new world in a cutter, or brigantine, or pink of no great tonnage, while yet America was in her non-age. When Adeline, in all her growing sense of Juan's merits and his situation, felt on the whole an interest intense, partly perhaps because of fresh sensation, or that he had an air of innocence, which is for innocence a sad temptation, as women hate half measures on the whole, she 'gan to ponder how to save his soul. She had a good opinion of advice, like all who give and eke receive it gratis, for which small thanks are still the market price, even where the article at highest rate is. She thought upon the subject twice or thrice, and morally decided the best state is for morals marriage. And this question carried, she seriously advised him to get married. Juan replied, with all becoming deference, he had a predilection for that tie, but that at present, with immediate reference to his own circumstances, there might lie some difficulties, as in his own preference, or that of her to whom he might apply; that still he'd wed with such or such a lady, if that they were not married all already. Next to the making of matches for herself and daughters, brothers, sisters, kith, or kin, arranging them like books upon the shelf, there's nothing women love to dabble in more, like a stockholder in growing pelf, than match-making in general. 'Tis no sin, certes, but a preventative, and therefore that is, no doubt, the only reason wherefore. But never yet, except of course a miss unwed, or mistress never to be wed, or wed already, who object to this, was there chaste dame who had not in her head some drama of the marriage unities, observed as strictly both at board and bed as those of Aristotle, though sometimes they turn out melodrames or pantomimes. They generally have some only son, some heir to a large property, some friend of an old family, some gay Sir John, or grave Lord George, with whom perhaps might end a line, and leave posterity undone, unless a marriage was applied to mend the prospects and their morals. and besides they have at hand a blooming glut of brides. From these they will be careful to select for this an heiress, and for that a beauty, for one a songstress who hath no defect, for t'other one who promises much duty, for this a lady no one can reject, whose sole accomplishments were quite a booty, a second for her excellent connections, a third because there can be no objections. When Rapp the harmonist embargoed marriage in his Harmonious Settlement, which flourishes, strangely enough, as yet without miscarriage, because it breeds no more mouths than it nourishes, without those sad expenses which disparage what nature naturally most encourages, why called he harmony a state sans wedlock? Now here I've got the preacher in a deadlock, because he either meant to sneer at harmony or marriage, by divorcing them thus oddly. But whether Reverend Rapp learn'd this in Germany or no, 'tis said his sect is rich and godly, pious and pure beyond what I can term any of ours, though they propagate more broadly. My objection's to his title, not his ritual, although I wonder how it grew habitual. But Rapp is the reverse of zealous matrons, who favour, malgré Malthus, generation, professors of that genial art, and patrons of all the modest part of propagation, which after all at such a desperate rate runs, that half its produce tends to emigration, that sad result of passions and potatoes, two weeds which pose our economic Catos. Had Adeline read Malthus? I can't tell. I wish she had. The book's the 11th commandment, which says, "Thou shalt not marry, unless well." This he, as far as I can understand, meant. 'Tis not my purpose on his views to dwell, nor canvass what so eminent a hand meant, but certes it conducts to lives ascetic, or turning marriage into arithmetic. But Adeline, who probably presumed that Juan had enough of maintenance, or separate maintenance, in case 'twas doom'd, as on the whole it is an even chance that bridegrooms, after they are fairly groomed, may retrograde a little in the dance of marriage, which might form a painter's fame, like Holbein's Dance of Death, but 'tis the same. But Adeline determined Juan's wedding in her own mind, and that's enough for woman. But then with whom? There was the sage Miss Reading, Miss Raw, Miss Flaw, Miss Showman, and Miss No Man, and the two fair co-heiresses gilt-bedding. She deemed his merits something more than common. All these were unobjectionable matches, and might go on, if well wound up, like watches. There was Miss Millpond, smooth as summer's sea, that usual paragon, an only daughter, who seem'd the cream of equanimity till skimm'd. And then there was some milk and water, with a slight shade of blue too, it might be, beneath the surface. But what did it matter? Love's riotous, but marriage should have quiet, and being consumptive, live on a milk diet. And then there was Miss Audacia Shoestring, a dashing demoiselle of good estate, whose heart was fixed upon a star, or blue string. But whether English dukes grew rare of late, or that she had not harped upon the true string by which such sirens can attract our great, she took up with some foreign younger brother, a Russ or Turk, the one's as good as t'other. And then there was—but why should I go on, unless the ladies should go off? There was indeed a certain fair and fairy one, of the best class, and better than her class, Aurora Raby, a young star who shone o'er life too sweet an image for such glass, a lovely being, scarce form'd or moulded, a rose with all its sweetest leaves yet folded, rich, noble, but an orphan, left an only child to the care of guardians good and kind, but still her aspect had an air so lonely. Blood is not water, and where shall we find feelings of youth like those which overthrown lie by death, when we are left, alas, behind, to feel in friendless palaces a home is wanting, and our best ties in the tomb? Early in years, and yet more infantine in figure, She had something of sublime in eyes which sadly shone as seraphs shine, all youth, but with an aspect beyond time, radiant and grave as pitying man's decline, mournful, but mournful of another's crime. She look'd as if she sat by Eden's door, and grieved for those who could return no more. She was a Catholic too, sincere, austere as far as her own gentle heart allowed, and deem'd that fallen worship far more dear, perhaps because 'twas fallen. Her sires were proud of deeds and days when they had filled the ear of nations, and had never bent or bowed to novel power; and as she was the last, she held their old faith and old feelings fast. She gazed upon a world she scarcely knew, as seeking not to know it. Silent, lone, as grows a flower, thus quietly she grew, and kept her heart serene within its zone. There was an awe in the homage which she drew. Her spirit seem'd as seated on a throne apart from the surrounding world, and strong in its own strength, most strange in one so young. Now it so happened, in the catalogue of Adeline, Aurora was omitted, although her birth and wealth had given her vogue beyond the charmers we have already cited. Her beauty also seem'd to form no clog against her being mentioned as well fitted, by many virtues, to be worth the trouble of single gentlemen who would be double. And this omission, like that of the bust of Brutus at the pageant of Tiberius, made Juan wonder, as no doubt he must. This he expressed half smiling and half serious, when Adeline replied with some disgust, and with an air, to say the least, imperious. She marvelled what he saw in such a baby as that prim, silent, cold Aurora Raby. Juan rejoined, she was a Catholic, and therefore fittest, as of his persuasion, since he was sure his mother would fall sick, and the Pope thunder excommunication if— But here Adeline, who seem'd to pique herself extremely on the inoculation of others with her own opinions, stated, as usual, the same reason which she late did. And wherefore not? A reasonable reason, if good, is none the worse for repetition. If bad, the best way's certainly to tease on and amplify. You lose much by concision, whereas insisting in or out of season convinces all men, even a politician; or, what is just the same, it wearies out. So the end's gained, what signifies the rout? Why Adeline had this slight prejudice, for prejudice it was, against a creature as pure as sanctity itself from vice, with all the added charm of form and feature, for me appears a question far too nice, since Adeline was liberal by nature. But nature's nature, and has more caprices than I have time or will to take to pieces. Perhaps she did not like the quiet way with which Aurora on those baubles look'd which charm most people in their earlier day. For there are few things by mankind less brook'd, and womankind too, if we so may say, than finding their genius stand rebuked, like Anthony's by Caesar, by the few who look upon them as they ought to do. It was not envy. Adeline had none, her place was far beyond it, and her mind. It was not scorn, which could not light on one whose greatest fault was leaving few to find. It was not jealousy, I think, but shun following the ignes fatui of mankind. It was not, but 'tis easier far, alas, to say what it was not than what it was. Little Aurora deem'd she was the theme of such discussion. She was there a guest, a beauteous ripple of the brilliant stream of rank and youth, though purer than the rest, which flow'd on for a moment in the beam time sheds a moment o'er each sparkling crest. Had she known this, she would have calmly smiled, she had so much, or little, of the child. Little Aurora deem'd she was the theme of such discussion. She was there a guest, a beauteous ripple of the brilliant stream of rank and youth, though purer than the rest, which flow'd on for a moment in the beam time sheds a moment o'er each sparkling crest. Had she known this, she would have calmly smiled, she had so much or little of the child. The dashing and proud air of Adeline imposed not upon her. She saw her blaze much as she would have seen a glowworm shine, then turned unto the stars for loftier rays. Juan was something she could not divine, being no sibyl in the new world's ways, yet she was nothing dazzled by the meteor, because she did not pin her faith on feature. His fame too, for he had that kind of fame which sometimes plays the deuce with womankind, a heterogeneous mass of glorious blame, half virtues and whole vices being combined, faults which attract because they are not tame, follies tricked out so brightly that they blind. These seals upon her wax made no impression, such was her coldness or her self-possession. Juan knew naught of such a character, high, yet resembling not his lost Haidee. Yet each was radiant in her proper sphere, the island girl, bred up by the lone sea, more warm, as lovely, and not less sincere, was nature's all. Aurora could not be, nor would be thus. The difference in them was such as lies between a flower and gem. Having wound up with this sublime comparison, methinks we may proceed upon our narrative, and as my friend Scott says, I sound my warison. Scott, the superlative of my comparative. Scott, who can paint your Christian knight, or Saracen, serf, lord, man, with such skill as none would share it, if there had not been one Shakespeare and Voltaire, of one or both of whom he seems the heir. I say, in my slight way I may proceed to play upon the surface of humanity. I write the world, nor care if the world read, at least for this I cannot spare its vanity. My muse hath bred, and still perhaps may breed, more foes by this same scroll. When I began it I thought that it might turn out so, now I know it, but still I am, or was, a pretty poet. The conference or congress, for it ended as congresses of late do, of the Lady Adeline and Don Juan, rather blended some acids with the sweets, for she was heady. But ere the matter could be marr'd or mended, the silvery bell rang, not for dinner ready, but for that hour, called half-hour, given to dress, though ladies' robes seem scant enough for less. Great things were now to be achieved at table, with massy plate for armour, knives and forks for weapons. But what muse since Homer's able, his feasts are not the worst part of his works, to draw up in array a single day bill of modern dinners, where more mystery lurks in soups or sauces, or a sole ragout, than witches, bitches, or physicians brew? There was a goodly soup à la bonne femme, though God knows whence it came from. There was too a turbot for relief of those who cram, relieved with dindon à la Périgot. There also was, the sinner that I am, how shall I get this gourmand stanza through, soup à la Beauveau, whose relief was dory, relieved itself by pork for greater glory. But I must crowd all into one grand mess or mass, for I should stretch into detail. My muse would run much more into excess, than when some squeamish people deem her frail. But though a bon vivant, I must confess her stomach's not her peccant part. This tale, however, doth require some slight refection, just to relieve her spirits from dejection. Fowls à la Condé, slices eke of salmon, with sauces genevoise, and a haunch of venison. Wines too, which might again have slain young Amun, a man like whom I hope we shan't see many soon. They also set a glazed Westphalian ham on, whereon Apicus would bestow his benison. And then there was champagne with foaming whirls, as white as Cleopatra's melted pearls. Then there was God knows what, à l'Allemande, à l'Espagnole, Tambal and salpicon, with things I can't withstand or understand, though swallow'd with much zest upon the whole, and entremet to piddle with at hand, gently to lull down the subsiding soul, while great Lucullus's robe triumphant muffles (there's fame) young partridge fillets deck'd with truffles. What are the fillets on a victor's brow to these? They are rags or dust. Where is the arch which nodded to the nation's spoils below? Where the triumphal chariot's haughty march? Gone to where victories must like dinners go. Further I shall not follow the research, but oh, ye modern heroes with your cartridges, when will your name lend lustre e'en to partridges? Those truffles, too, are no bad accessories, followed by petit puits d'amour, a dish of which perhaps the cookery rather varies, so every one may dress it to his wish, according to the best of dictionaries, which encyclopedize both flesh and fish. But even sans confiture, it no less true is, there's pretty picking in those petits puits. The mind is lost in mighty contemplation of intellect expanded on 2 courses, and indigestion's grand multiplication requires arithmetic beyond my forces. Who would suppose from Adam's simple ration that cookery could have called forth such resources as form a science and a nomenclature from out the commonest demands of nature? The glasses jingled and the palates tingled, the diners of celebrity dined well, the ladies with more moderation mingled in the feast, pecking less than I can tell. Also the younger men too, for a springald can't, like ripe age, in gourmandise excel, but thinks less of good eating than the whisper, when seated next him, of some pretty lisper. Alas! I must leave undescribed the gibier, the salami, the consommé, the purée, all which I use to make my rhymes run glibber than could roast beef in our rough John Bull way. I must not introduce even a spare rib here. Bubble and squeak would spoil my liquid lay, but I have dined, and must forego, alas, the chaste description even of a bécasse, and fruits and ice, and all that art refines from nature for the service of the goût. Taste, or the gout, pronounce it as inclines your stomach. Ere you dine, the French will do, but after, there are sometimes certain signs which prove plain English truer of the two. Hast ever had the gout? I have not had it, but I may have, and you too, reader, dread it. The simple olives, best allies of wine, must I pass over in my bill of fare? I must, although a favourite plat of mine, in Spain and Lucca, Athens, everywhere. On them and bread 'twas oft my luck to dine, the grass my tablecloth, in open air, on Sunium or Hymettus, like Diogenes, of whom half my philosophy the progeny is. Amidst this tumult of fish, flesh, and fowl, and vegetables, all in masquerade, the guests were placed according to their role, but various as the various meats displayed. Don Juan sat next à l'Espagnole, no damsel, but a dish, as hath been said, but so far like a lady that 'twas dress'd superbly, and contained a world of zest. By some odd chance, too, he was placed between Aurora and the Lady Adeline, a situation difficult, I ween, for man therein with eyes and heart to dine. Also the conference which we have seen was not such as to encourage him to shine, for Adeline, addressing few words to him, with 2 transcendent eyes seem'd to look through him. I sometimes almost think that eyes have ears. This much is sure, that out of earshot things are somehow echoed to the pretty dears, of which I can't tell whence their knowledge springs. Like that same mystic music of the spheres, which no one hears, so loudly though it rings. 'Tis wonderful how oft the sex have heard long dialogues, which pass'd without a word. Aurora sat with that indifference which piques a preux chevalier, as it ought. Of all offences that's the worst offence, which seems to hint you are not worth a thought. Now Juan, though no coxcomb in pretence, was not exactly pleased to be so caught, like a good ship entangled among ice, and after so much excellent advice. To his gay nothings nothing was replied, or something which was nothing, as urbanity required. Aurora scarcely look'd aside, nor even smiled enough for any vanity. The devil was in the girl. Could it be pride, or modesty, or absence, or inanity? Heaven knows. But Adeline's malicious eyes sparkled with her successful prophecies, and looked as much as if to say, "I said it." A kind of triumph I'll not recommend, because it sometimes, as I have seen or read it, both in the case of lover and of friend, will pique a gentleman for his own credit to bring what was a jest to a serious end. For all men prophesy what is or was, and hate those who won't let them come to pass. Juan was drawn thus into some attention, slight but select, and just enough to express to females of perspicuous comprehensions that he would rather make them more than less. Aurora at the last, so history mentions, though probably much less a fact than guess, so far relaxed her thoughts from their sweet prison as once or twice to smile, if not to listen. From answering she began to question. This with her was rare, and Adeline, who as yet thought her predictions went not much amiss, began to dread she'd thaw to a coquette. So very difficult, they say, it is to keep extremes from meeting, when once set in motion. But she here too much refined. Aurora's spirit was not of that kind. But Juan had a sort of winning way, a proud humility, if such there be, which show'd such deference to what females say, as if each charming word were a decree. His tact, too, temper'd him from grave to gay, and taught him when to be reserved or free. He had the art of drawing people out, without their seeing what he was about. Aurora, who in her indifference confounded him in common with the crowd of flatterers, though she deem'd he'd had more sense than whispering foplings or witlings loud, commenced, from such slight things will great commence, to feel that flattery which attracts the proud rather by deference than compliment, and wins even by a delicate descent. And then he had good looks. That point was carried nem. con. amongst the women, which I grieve to say oft leads to crim. con. with the married, a case which to the juries we may leave, since with digressions we too long have tarried. Now though we know of old that looks deceive, and always have done, somehow these good looks make more impression than the best of books. Aurora, who looked more on books than faces, was very young, although so very sage, admiring more Minerva than the Graces, especially upon a printed page. But Virtue's self, with all her tightest laces, has not the natural stays of strict old age, and Socrates, that model of all duty, own'd to a penchant, though discreet, for beauty. And girls of 16 are thus far Socratic, but innocently so, as Socrates. And really, if the sage sublime and Attic at 70 years had fantasies like these, which Plato's in his dialogue dramatic has shown, I know not why they should displease in virgins. Always in a modest way, observe, for that with me's a sine qua. Also observe that, like the great Lord Coke, see Littleton, whene'er I have expressed opinions two, which at first sight may look twin opposites, the second is the best. Perhaps I have a third too in a nook, or none at all, which seems a sorry jest. But if a writer should be quite consistent, how could he possibly show things existent? If people contradict themselves, can I help contradicting them? And everybody, even my voracious self? But that's a lie, I never did so, never will. How should I? He who doubts all things nothing can deny. Truth's fountains may be clear, her streams are muddy, and cut through such canals of contradiction, that she must often navigate o'er fiction. Apologue, fable, poesy, and parable are false, but may be render'd also true by those who sow them in a land that's arable. 'Tis wonderful what fable will not do. 'Tis said it makes reality more bearable. But what's reality? Who has its clue? Philosophy? No, she too much rejects. Religion? Yes, but which of all her sects? Some millions must be wrong, that's pretty clear. Perhaps it may turn out that all were right. God help us, since we have need on our career to keep our holy beacons always bright, 'tis time that some new prophet should appear, or old indulge man with a second sight. Opinions wear out in some 1,000 years without a small refreshment from the spheres. But here again, why will I thus entangle myself with metaphysics? None can hate so much as I do any kind of wrangle, and yet such is my folly or my fate, I always knock my head against some angle about the present, past, or future state. Yet I wish well to Trojan and to Tyrian, for I was bred a moderate Presbyterian. But though I am a temperate theologian, and also meek as a metaphysician, impartial between Tyrian and Trojan, as Eldon on a lunatic commission, in politics my duty is to show John Bull something of the lower world's condition. It makes my blood boil like the springs of Hecla to see men let these scoundrel sovereigns break law. But politics and policy and piety are topics which I sometimes introduce, not only for the sake of their variety, but as subservient to a moral use, because my business is to dress society and stuff with sage that very verdant goose. And now that we may furnish with some matter all tastes, we're going to try the supernatural. And now I will give up all argument, and positively henceforth no temptation shall fool me to the top-up of my bent. Yes, I'll begin a thorough reformation. Indeed, I never knew what people meant by deeming that my muse's conversation was dangerous. I think she is as harmless as some who labour more, and yet may charm less. Grim reader, did you ever see a ghost? No, but you have heard? I understand. Be dumb, and don't regret the time you may have lost, for you have got that pleasure still to come. And do not think I mean to sneer at most of these things, or by ridicule benumb that source of the sublime and the mysterious. For certain reasons, my belief is serious. Serious? You laugh. You may. That will I not. My smiles must be sincere, or not at all. I say I do believe a haunted spot exists. And where? That shall I not recall, because I'd rather it should be forgot. Shadows upon the soul of Richard may appall. In short, upon that subject I've some qualms very like those of the philosopher Malmesbury. The night I sing by night, sometimes an owl, and now and then a nightingale, is dim, and the loud shrieks of sage Minerva's fowl rattles round me her discordant hymn. Old portraits from old walls upon me scowl. I wish to heaven they would not look so grim. The dying embers dwindle in the grate. I think too that I have sat up too late, and therefore, though 'tis by no means my way to rhyme at noon, when I have other things to think of, if I ever think, I say I feel some chilly midnight shudderings, and prudently postpone until midday treating a topic which, alas, but brings shadows. But you must be in my condition before you learn to call this superstition. Between two worlds life hovers like a star, 'twixt night and morn upon the horizon's verge. How little do we know that which we are, how less what we may be! The eternal surge of time and tide rolls on, and bears afar our bubbles. As the old burst, new emerge, lash'd from the foam of ages, while the graves of empire heave but like some passing waves. End of Canto 15 of Don Juan, by Gordon Lord Byron. Canto 16 of Don Juan, by Gordon Lord Byron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Peter Gallagher. The antique Persians taught 3 useful things: to draw the bow, to ride, and speak the truth. This was the mode of Cyrus, best of kings, a mode adopted since by modern youth. Bows have they, generally with 2 strings, horses they ride without remorse or ruth. At speaking truth perhaps they are less clever, but draw the long bow better now than ever. The cause of this effect, or this defect, for this effect defective comes by cause, is what I have not leisure to inspect. But this I must say in my own applause: of all the muses that I recollect, whate'er may be her follies or her flaws in some things, mine's beyond all contradiction the most sincere that ever dealt in fiction. And as she treats all things and ne'er retreats from anything, this epic will contain a wilderness of the most rare conceits, which you might elsewhere hope to find in vain. 'Tis true there be some bitters with the sweets, yet mix'd so slightly that you can't complain. But wonder they so few are, since my tale is de rebus cunctis et quibus de melius. But of all the truths which she has told, the most true is that which she is about to tell. I said it was a story of a ghost. What then? I only know it so befell. Have you explored the limits of the coast where all the dwellers of the earth must dwell? 'Tis time to strike such puny doubters dumb as the sceptics who would not believe Columbus. Some people would impose now with authority Turpin's or Monmouth Jeffrey's chronicle, men whose historical superiority is always greatest at a miracle. But Saint Augustine has the great priority, who bids all men believe the impossible, because 'tis so. Who nibble, scribble, quibble, he quiets at once with quia impossibili. And therefore, mortals, cavil not at all, believe. If 'tis improbable, you must, and if it is impossible, you shall. 'Tis always best to take things upon trust. I do not speak profanely, to recall those holier mysteries which the wise and just receive as gospel, and which grow more rooted, as all truths must, the more they are disputed. I merely mean to say what Johnson said, that in the course of some 6,000 years all nations have believed that from the dead a visitant at interval appears. And what is strangest upon this strange head is, that whatever bar the reason rears against such belief, there's something stronger still in its behalf, let those deny who will. The dinner and the soirée too were done, the supper too discussed. The dames admired, the banqueteers had dropped off one by one, the song was silent, and the dance expired. The last thin petticoats were vanish'd, gone like fleecy clouds into the sky retired, and nothing brighter gleam'd through the saloon than dying tapers and the peeping moon. The evaporation of a joyous day is like the last glass of champagne without the foam which made its virgin bumper gay, or like a system coupled with a doubt, or like a soda bottle when its spray has sparkled and left half its spirit out, or like a billow left by storms behind without the animation of the wind, or like an opiate which brings troubled rest or none, or like nothing that I know except itself. Such is the human breast, a thing of which similitudes can show no real likeness, like the old Tyrian vest, dyed purple. None at present can tell how, if from a shellfish or from cochineal. So perish every tyrant's robe piecemeal. But next to dressing for a rout or ball, undressing is a woe. Our robe de chambre may sit like that of Nessus, and recall thoughts quite as yellow, but less clear than amber. Titus exclaimed, "I've lost a day." Of all the nights and days most people can remember, I've had of both some, not to be disdained. I wish they'd state how many they have gained. And Juan, on retiring for the night, felt restless and perplexed and compromised. He thought Aurora Raby's eyes more bright than Adeline such as advice advised. If he had known exactly his own plight, he probably would have philosophized, a great resource to all, and ne'er denied till wanted. Therefore Juan only sighed. He sighed. The next resource is the full moon, where all sighs are deposited, and now it happened, luckily, the chaste orb shone as clear as such a climate will allow, and Juan's mind was in the proper tone to hail her with the apostrophe, "O thou!" of amatory egoism, the twoism, which further to explain would be a truism. But lover, poet, or astronomer, shepherd or swain, whoever may behold, feel some abstraction when they gaze on her. Great thoughts we catch from thence, besides a cold sometimes, unless my feelings rather err. Deep secrets to her rolling light are told, Ocean's tides and mortals' brains she sways, And also hearts, if there be truth in lays. Juan felt somewhat pensive, and disposed for contemplation rather than his pillow. The Gothic chamber where he was enclosed let in the rippling sound of the lake's billow, with all the mystery by midnight caused. Below his window waved, of course, a willow, and he stood gazing out on the cascade that flashed and after darkened in the shade. Upon his table or his toilet, which of these is not exactly ascertained, I state this, for I am cautious to a pitch of nicety where the fact is to be gained, a lamp burned high, while he leaned from a niche where many a Gothic ornament remained, in chiselled stone and painted glass, and all that time has left our fathers of their hall. Then, as the night was clear, though cold, he threw his chamber door wide open, and went forth into a gallery of a sombre hue, long furnished with old pictures of great worth, of knights and dames heroic and chaste too, as doubtless should be people of high birth. But by dim lights the portraits of the dead have something ghastly, desolate, and dread. The forms of the grim knight and pictured saint looked living in the moon, and as you turn backward and forward to the echoes faint of your own footsteps, voices from the urn appear to wake, and shadows wild and quaint start from the frames which fence their aspect stern, as if to ask how you can dare to keep a vigil there, where all but death should sleep. And the pale smile of beauties in the grave, and the charms of other days, in starlight gleams glimmer on high. Their buried locks still wave along the canvas, their eyes dance like dreams on ours, or spars within some dusky cave, but death is imaged in their shadowy beams. A picture is the past, even ere its frame be gilt, who sat hath ceased to be the same. As Juan mused on mutability, or on his mistress, terms synonymous, no sound except the echo of his sigh or step ran sadly through that antique house, when suddenly he heard, or thought so, nigh a supernatural agent, or a mouse whose little nibbling rustle will embarrass most people as it plays along the arras. It was no mouse, but lo! a monk arrayed in cowl and beads and dusky garb appeared, now in the moonlight and now lapsed in shade, with steps that trode as heavily yet unheard. His garments only a slight murmur made, he moved as shadowy as the sisters weird, but slowly, and as he passed Juan by, glanced without pausing on him a bright eye. Juan was petrified. He had heard a hint of such a spirit in these halls of old, but thought, like most men, there was nothing in't, beyond the rumour which such spots unfold, coin'd from surviving superstitions, mint, which passes ghosts in currency like gold, but rarely seen, like gold compared with paper. And did he see this, or was it vapour? Once, twice, thrice repass'd the thing of air or earth, beneath or heaven, or t'other place, and Juan gazed upon it with a stare, yet could not speak or move, but on its base as stands a statue stood. He felt his hair twine like a knot of snakes around his face. He taxed his tongue for words which were not granted, to ask the reverend person what he wanted. The third time, after a still longer pause, the shadow pass'd away. But where? The hall was long, and thus far there was no great cause to think his vanishing unnatural. Doors there were many, through which, by the laws of physics, bodies, whether short or tall, might come or go, but Juan could not state through which the spectre seemed to evaporate. He stood, how long he knew not, but it seemed an age, expectant, powerless, with his eyes strained on the spot where first the figure gleam'd. Then by degrees recall'd his energy, and would have passed the whole off as a dream, but could not wake. He was, he did surmise, waking already, and return'd at length back to his chamber, shorn of half his strength. All there was as he left it. Still his taper burn'd, and not blew, as modest tapers use, receiving sprites with sympathetic vapour. He rubb'd his eyes, and they did not refuse their office. He took up an old newspaper, the paper was right easy to peruse. He read an article, the king attacking, and a long eulogy of patent blacking. This savoured of this world, but his hand shook, and he shut his door, and after having read a paragraph, I think about horn took, undress'd, and rather slowly went to bed. There couch'd all snugly on his pillow's nook, with what he had seen his fantasy he fed, and though it was no opiate, slumber crept upon him by degrees, and so he slept. He woke betimes, and, as may be supposed, ponder'd upon his visitant or vision, and whether it ought not to be disclosed, at risk of being quizzed for superstition. The more he thought, the more his mind was posed. In the meantime, his valet, whose precision was great, because his master brooked no less, knock'd to inform him it was time to dress. He dress'd, and like young people he was wont to take some trouble with his toilet, but this morning rather spent less time upon it. Aside his very mirror soon was put, his curls fell negligently o'er his front, his clothes were not curb'd to their usual cut, his very neckcloth's Gordian knot was tied almost an hair's breadth too much on one side. And when he walk'd down into the saloon, he sat him pensive o'er a dish of tea, which he perhaps had not discover'd soon, had it not happened scalding hot to be, which made him have recourse unto his spoon. So much distrait he was, that all could see that something was the matter, Adeline the first, but what she could not well divine. She look'd and saw him pale, and turn'd as pale herself, then hastily look'd down, and mutter'd something, but what's not stated in my tale. Lord Henry said his muffin was ill butter'd. The Duchess of Fitzfalk play'd with her veil, and look'd at Juan hard, but nothing utter'd. Aurora Raby, with her large dark eyes, survey'd him with a kind of calm surprise. But seeing him all cold and silent still, and everybody wondering more or less, fair Adeline inquired if he were ill. He started, and said, "Yes, no, rather, yes." The family physician had great skill, and being present, now began to express his readiness to feel his pulse and tell the cause. But Juan said he was quite well. "Quite well, yes, no." These answers were mysterious, and yet his looks appear'd to sanction both, however they might savour of delirious. Something like illness of a sudden growth weighed on his spirit, though by no means serious. But for the rest, as he himself seem'd loath to state the case, it might be ta'en for granted it was not the physician that he wanted. Lord Henry, who had now discussed his chocolate, Also the muffin whereof he complain'd said Juan had not got his usual look elate, at which he marvell'd, since it had not rain'd. Then asked her grace what news were of the duke of late. Her grace replied, his grace was rather pain'd with some light hereditary twinges of gout, which rusts aristocratic hinges. Then Henry turn'd to Juan, and address'd a few words of condolence on his state. "You look," quoth he, "as if you'd had your rest broke in upon the Black Friar of late." "What friar?" said Juan, and he did his best to put the question with an air sedate or careless, but the effort was not valid to hinder him from growing still more pallid. "Oh, have you never heard of the Black Friar, the spirit of these walls?" "In truth, not I." "Why, but fame, you know, sometimes a liar, tells an odd story, which by and by. Whether with time the spectre has grown shyer, or that our sires had a more gifted eye for such sights, though the tale is half believed, the friar of late has not oft been perceived. The last time was—" "I pray," said Adeline, who watch'd the changes of Don Juan's brow, and from its context thought she could divine connections stronger than he chose to avow with this same legend, "if you but design to jest, you'll choose some other theme just now, because the present tale has oft been told, and is not much improved by growing old." "Jest?" quoth Milor. "Why, Adeline, you know that we ourselves— 'Twas in the honeymoon, so—" "Well, no matter, 'twas so long ago. But come, I'll set your story to a tune. Graceful as Dian, when she draws her bow, She seized her harp, whose strings were kindled soon As touch'd, and plaintively began to play The air of 'Twas a friar of orders grey." "But add the words," cried Henry, "which you made, For Adeline is half a poetess." Turning round to the rest, he smiling said, "Of course the others could not but express In courtesy their wish to see display'd By one 3 talents, for they were no less: The voice, the words, the harper's skill at once Could hardly be united by a dunce." After some fascinating hesitation, The charming of these charmers who seem bound, I can't tell why, to this dissimulation, Fair Adeline, with eyes fix'd on the ground At first, then kindling into animation, Added her sweet voice to the lyric sound, And sang with much simplicity, a merit Not the less precious that we seldom hear it. "Beware, beware of the Black Friar, who sitteth by Norman stone, For he mutters his prayer in the midnight air, And his mass of the days that are gone. When the lord of the hill, Amundeville, Made Norman church his prey, And expell'd the friars, one friar still Would not be driven away, Though he came in his might, with King Henry's right, To turn church lands to lay, With sword in hand and torch to light their walls if they said nay. A monk remain'd, unchased, unchain'd, And he did not seem form'd of clay, For he's seen in the porch, and he's seen in the church, Though he is not seen by day. And whether for good or whether for ill, It is not mine to say, But still with the house of Amundeville He bideth night and day. By the marriage bed of the lords, 'tis said, He flits on the bridal eve, And 'tis held as faith to their bed of death He comes, but not to grieve. When an heir is born, he's heard to mourn, And when aught is to befall that ancient line, In the wee moonshine he walks from hall to hall. His form you may trace, but not his face, 'Tis shadow'd by his cowl, but his eyes may be seen From the folds between, and they seem of a parted soul. But beware, beware of the Black Friar, He still retains his sway, For he is yet the church's heir, Whoever may be the lay. Amundeville is the lord by day, But the monk is lord by night, Nor wine nor wassail could rise a vassal To question that friar's right. Say nought to him as he walks the hall, And he'll say nought to you; He sweeps along in his dusty pall, As o'er the grass the dew. Then gramercy for the Black Friar! Heaven sain him, fair or foul! And whatsoe'er may be his prayer, Let ours be for his soul." The lady's voice ceased, and the thrilling wires Died from the touch that kindled them to sound, And the pause followed, which, when song expires, Pervades a moment those who listen round. And then, of course, the circle much admires, Nor less applauds, as in politeness bound, The tones, the feeling, and the execution. to the performer's diffident confusion. Fair Adeline, though in a careless way, as if she rated such accomplishment as the mere pastime of an idle day, pursued an instant for her own content, would now and then, as 'twere, without display, yet with display in fact, at times relent to such performances with haughty smile, to show she could, if 'twere worth her while. Now this, but we will whisper it aside, was, pardon the pedantic illustration, trampling on Plato's pride with greater pride, as did the cynic on some like occasion, deeming the sage would be much mortified, or thrown into a philosophic passion for a spoiled carpet. But the Attic bee was much consoled by his own repartee. Thus Adeline would throw into the shade, by doing easily whene'er she chose what dilettanti do with vast parade, their sort of half-profession. For it grows to something like this when too oft displayed, and that it is so everybody knows, who've heard Miss That, or this, or Lady T'other show off, to please their company or mother. Oh, the long evenings of duets and trios, the admirations and the speculations, the mamma mias and the amo mios, the tanti palpitis on such occasions, the lasciami and the quavering adios, amongst our own most musical of nations, with tu mi cames from Portingale to soothe our ears, lest Italy should fail. In Babylon's bravuras, as the home heart ballads of green Erin or grey Highlands, that bring Lochaber back to eyes that roam o'er far Atlantic continents or islands, the calentures of music which o'ercome all mountaineers with dreams that they are nigh lands no more to be beheld but in such visions, was Adeline well versed as compositions. She also had a twilight tinge of blue, could write rhymes, and compose more than she wrote, made epigrams occasionally too upon her friends, as everybody ought, but still from that sublimer azure hue, so much the present dye, she was remote, and weak enough to deem Pope a great poet, and what was worse, not ashamed to show it. Aurora, since we are touching upon taste, which nowadays is the thermometer by whose degrees all characters are classed, was more Shakespearean, if I do not err. The worlds beyond this world's perplexing waste had more of her existence, for in her there was a depth of feeling to embrace thoughts boundless, deep, but silent too as space. Not so her gracious, graceful, graceless grace, the full-grown Hebe of Fitzfalk, whose mind, if she had any, was upon her face, and that was of a fascinating kind. A little turn for mischief you might trace also thereon, but that's not much. We find few females without some such gentle leaven, for fear we should suppose us quite in heaven. I have not heard she was at all poetic, though once she was seen reading the Bath Guide and Halley's Triumphs, which she deemed pathetic because, she said, her temper had been tried so much, the bard had really been prophetic of what she had gone through with since a bride. But of all verse, what most ensured her praise were sonnets to herself, or bourrimées. 'Twere difficult to say what was the object of Adeline in bringing this same lay to bear upon what appeared to her the subject of Juan's nervous feelings on that day. Perhaps she merely had the simple project to laugh him out of his supposed dismay. Perhaps she might wish to confirm him in it, though why I cannot say, at least this minute. But so far the immediate effect was to restore him to his self-propriety, a thing quite necessary to the effect who wished to take the tone of their society, in which you cannot be too circumspect, whether the mode be persiflage or piety, but wear the newest mantle of hypocrisy, on pain of much displeasing the gynocracy. And therefore Juan now began to rally his spirits, and without more explanation to jest upon such themes in many a sally. Her grace too also seized the same occasion with various similar remarks to tally, but wished for a still more detailed narration of this same mystic friar's curious doings, about the present family's death and wooings. Of these few could say more than has been said. They passed as such things do for superstition with some, while others, who had more in dread the theme, half credited the strange tradition. and much was talked on all sides on that head. But Juan, when cross-questioned on the vision which some supposed, though he had not avowed it, had stirred him, answer'd in a way to cloud it. And then the midday having worn to one, the company prepared to separate, some to their several pastimes, or to none, some wondering 'twas so early, some so late. There was a goodly match, too, to be run between some greyhounds on my lord's estate, and a young racehorse of old pedigree match'd for the spring, whom several went to see. There was a picture dealer who had bought a special Titian, warranted original, so precious that it was not to be bought, though princes the possessor were besieging all. The king himself had cheapened it, but thought the civil list he deigns to accept, obliging all his subjects by his gracious acceptation, too scanty in these times of low taxation. But as Lord Henry was a connoisseur, the friend of artists, if not arts, the owner with motives the most classical and pure, so that he would have been the very donor rather than the seller had his wants been fewer, so much he deemed his patronage an honour, had bought the Capodopera, not for sale, but for his judgment, never known to fail. There was a modern a Gothic bricklayer of Babel, called an architect, bought to survey these grey walls, which, though so thick, might have from time acquired some slight defect, who, after rummaging the abbey through thick and thin, produced a plan whereby to erect new buildings of correctest conformation, and throw down old, which he called restoration. The cost would be a trifle, an old song set to some thousands, 'tis the usual burden of that same tune when people hum it long. The price would speedily repay its worth in an edifice no less sublime than strong, by which Lord Henry's good taste would go forth in its glory, through all ages shining sunny for Gothic daring shown in English money. There were 2 lawyers busy on a mortgage Lord Henry wished to raise for a new purchase, also a lawsuit upon tenures burgage, and one on tithes, which sure are discord's torches, kindling religion till she throws down her gauge, untying squires to fight against the churches. There was a prize ox, a prize pig, and ploughman, for Henry was a sort of Sabine showman. There were 2 poachers caught in a steel trap, ready for jail, their place of convalescence. There was a country girl in a close cap and scarlet cloak. I hate the sight to see, since in youth I had the sad mishap, but luckily I have paid few parish fees since. That scarlet cloak, alas, unclosed with rigour, presents the problem of a double figure. A reel within a bottle is a mystery, one can't tell how it e'er got in or out. And therefore the present piece of natural history I leave to those who are fond of solving doubt, and merely state, though not for the consistory, Lord Henry was a justice, and that Scout the constable, beneath a warrant's banner, had bagged this poacher upon nature's manner. Now justices of peace must judge all pieces of mischief of all kinds, and keep the game and morals of the country from caprices of those who have not a licence for the same. And of all things, excepting tithes and leases, perhaps these are most difficult to tame. Preserving partridges and pretty wenches are puzzles to the most precautious benches. The present culprit was extremely pale, pale as if painted so, her cheek being red by nature, as in higher dames less hale 'tis white, at least when they just rise from bed. Perhaps she was ashamed of seeming frail, poor soul, for she was country born and bred, and knew no better in her immorality than to wax white, for blushes are for quality. Her black, bright, downcast, yet a spiegel eye had gathered a large tear into its corner, which the poor thing at times essayed to dry, for she was not a sentimental mourner, parading all her sensibility, nor insolent enough to scorn the scorner, but stood in trembling, patient tribulation to be called up for her examination. Of course these groups were scattered here and there, not nigh the gay saloon of ladies gent, the lawyers in the study, and in air the prize pig, ploughman, poachers. The men sent from town, viz. Architect and dealer, were both busy, as a general in his tent writing dispatches, in their several stations, exulting in their brilliant lucubrations. But this poor girl was left in the great hall, while Scout, the parish guardian of the frail, discussed (he hated beer yclept the small) a mighty mug of moral double ale. She waited until justice could recall its kind attentions to their proper pale, to name a thing in nomenclature rather perplexing for most virgins— a child's father. You see, here was enough of occupation for Lord Henry, linked with dogs and horses. There was much bustle too, and preparation below stairs, on the score of second courses, because, as suits their rank and situation, those who in counties have great land resources have public days, when all men make carouse, though not exactly what's called open house. But once a week or fortnight, uninvited, thus we translate a general invitation, all country gentlemen, esquired or knighted, may drop in without cards, and take their station at the full board, and sit alike delighted with fashionable wines and conversation, and, as the isthmus of the grand connection, talk o'er themselves the past and next election. Lord Henry was a great electioneerer, burrowing for boroughs like a rat or rabbit; but county contests cost him rather dearer, because the neighbouring Scotch Earl of Gift-Gabbet had English influence in the same sphere here. His son, the Honourable Dick Diced-Rabbit, was member for the other interest, meaning the same self-interest with a different leaning. Courteous and cautious therefore in his county, he was all things to all men, and dispensed to some civility, to others bounty, and promises to all, which last commenced to gather to a somewhat large amount, he not calculating how much they condensed. But what with keeping some and breaking others, his word had the same value as another's. A friend to freedom and freeholders, yet no less a friend to government, he held that he exactly the just medium hit 'twixt place and patriotism. Albeit compelled, such was his sovereign's pleasure, though unfit, he added modestly, when rebels railed, to hold some sinecures he wished abolished, but that with them all law would be demolished. He was free to confess— whence comes this phrase? Is't English? No, 'tis only parliamentary— that innovation's spirit nowadays had made more progress than for the last century. He would not tread a factious path to praise, though for the public weal disposed to venture high. As for his place, he could but say this of it, that the fatigue was greater than the profit. Heaven and his friends knew that a private life had ever been his sole and whole ambition; but could he quit his king in time of strife, which threatened the whole country with perdition? When demagogues would with a butcher's knife cut through and through, oh damnable incision, the Gordian or the Geordian knot, whose strings have tied together commons, lords, and kings. Sooner come place into the civil list, and champion him to the utmost, he would keep it till duly disappointed or dismissed. Profit he cared not for, let others reap it; but should the day come when place ceased to exist, the country would have far more cause to weep it. For how could it go on? Explain who can. He gloried in the name of Englishman. He was as independent, ay, much more, than those who were not paid for independence, as common soldiers or a common shore have in their several arts or parts ascendants, or the irregulars in lust or gore, who do not give professional attendance. Thus on the mob all statesmen are as eager to prove their pride as footmen to a beggar. All this, save the last stanza, Henry said and thought. I say no more, I've said too much, for all of us have either heard or read off, or upon the hustings, some slight such hints from the independent heart or head of the official candidate. I'll touch no more on this. The dinner bell hath rung, and grace is said. The grace I should have sung, but I'm too late, and therefore must make play. 'Twas a great banquet, such as Albion old was wont to boast, as if a glutton's tray were something very glorious to behold. But 'twas a public feast and public day, quite full, right dull, guests hot, and dishes cold, great plenty, much formality, small cheer, and everybody out of their own sphere. the squires familiarly formal, and my lords and ladies proudly condescending, the very servants puzzling how to hand their plates, without it might be too much bending from their high places by the sideboard's stand, yet, like their masters, fearful of offending, for any deviation from the graces might cost both man and master too their places. There were some hunters bold and coursers keen, whose hounds ne'er err'd, nor greyhounds deign'd to lurch; some deadly shots too, Septembreses, seen earliest to rise, and last to quit the search of the poor partridge through his stubble screen. There were some massy members of the church, takers of tithes, and makers of good matches, and several who sung fewer psalms than catches. There were some country wags too, and, alas, some exiles from the town, who had been driven to gaze instead of pavement upon grass, and rise at 9 in lieu of long 11. And lo, upon that day it came to pass I sat next that overwhelming Son of Heaven, the very powerful Parson Peter Pith, the loudest wit I e'er was deafen'd with. I knew him in his livelier London days, a brilliant diner out, though but a curate, and not a joke he cut but earned its praise, until preferment coming at a sure rate— O Providence, how wondrous are thy ways, who would suppose thy gifts sometimes obdurate— gave him, to lay the devil who looks o'er Lincoln, a fat fen vicarage, and nought to think on. His jokes were sermons, and his sermons jokes, but both were thrown away amongst the fens, for wit hath no great friend in aguish folks. No longer ready ears and shorthand pens imbibed the gay bon mot or happy hoax. The poor priest was reduced to common sense, or to coarse efforts very loud and long, to hammer a horse laugh from the thick throng. There is a difference, says the song, between a beggar and a queen, or was of late the latter worse used of the two we've seen, but we'll say nothing of the affairs of state— a difference betwixt bishop and a dean, a difference between crockery ware and plate, as between English beef and Spartan broth, and yet great heroes have been bred by both. But of all nature's discrepancies, none upon the whole is greater than the difference beheld between the country and the town, of which the latter merits every preference from those who have few resources of their own, and only think or act or feel with reference to some small plan of interest or ambition, both which are limited to no condition. But en avant! The light loves languish o'er the long banquets and too many guests, although a slight repast makes people love much more, Bacchus and Ceres being, as we know even from our grammar upwards, friends of yore with vivifying Venus, who doth owe to these the invention of champagne and truffles. Temperance delights her, but long fasting ruffles. Dully pass'd o'er dinner of the day, and Juan took his place, he knew not where, confused in the confusion, and distrait, and sitting as if nailed upon his chair. Though knives and forks clank'd round as in a fray, he seem'd unconscious of all passing there, till some one, with a groan, express'd a wish, unheeded twice, to have a fin of fish. On which, at the third asking of the banns, he started, and perceiving smiles around broadening to grins, he coloured more than once, and hastily, as nothing can confound a wise man more than laughter from a dunce, inflicted on the dish a deadly wound, and with such hurry, that ere he could curb it, he had paid his neighbour's prayer with half a turbot. This was no bad mistake, as it occurr'd, the supplicator being an amateur, but others, who were left with scarce a third, were angry, as they well might, to be sure. They wonder'd how a young man so absurd Lord Henry at his table should endure, and this, and his not knowing how much oats had fallen at last market, cost his host 3 votes. They little knew, or might have sympathized, that he the night before had seen a ghost, a prologue which but slightly harmonized with the substantial company, engrossed by matter, and so much materialized, that one scarce knew at what to marvel most of the two things: how, the question rather odd is, such bodies could have souls, or souls such bodies? But what confused him more than smile or stare from all the squires and squiresses around, who wonder'd at the abstraction of his air, especially as he had been renowned for some vivacity among the fair, even in the country circles narrow bound, for little things upon my lord's estate were good small talk for others still less great, was that he caught Aurora's eye on his, and something like a smile upon her cheek. Now this he really rather took amiss. In those who rarely smile, their smiles bespeak a strong external motive, and in this smile of Aurora's there was nought to pique of hope or love, with any of the wiles which some pretend to trace in ladies' smiles. 'Twas a mere quite smile of contemplation, indicative of some surprise and pity, and Juan grew carnation with vexation, which was not very wise, and still less witty, since he had gained at least her observation, a most important outwork of the city, as Juan should have known, had not his senses by last night's ghost been driven from their defences. But what was bad, she did not blush in turn, nor seem embarrassed. Quite the contrary. Her aspect was as usual still, not stern, and she withdrew, but cast not down her eye, yet grew a little pale. With what? Concern? I know not, but her colour ne'er was high, though sometimes faintly flush'd, and always clear, as deep seas in a sunny atmosphere. But Adeline was occupied by fame this day, and watching, witching, condescending to the consumers of fish, fowl, and game, and dignity with courtesy so blending, as all must blend whose part it is to aim, especially as the 6th year is ending, at their lords, sons, or similar connections' safe conduct through the rocks of re-elections. Though this was the most expedient on the whole, and usual, Juan, when he cast a glance on Adeline while playing her grand rôle, which she went through as though it were a dance, betraying only now and then her soul by a look scarce perceptibly askance of weariness or scorn, began to feel some doubt how much of Adeline was real. So well she acted all and every part by turns, with that vivacious versatility which many people take for want of heart. They err. 'Tis merely what is called mobility, a thing of temperament and not of art, though seeming so from its supposed facility, and false, though true, for surely they're sincerest who are strongly acted on by what is nearest. This makes your actors, artists, and romancers heroes sometimes, though seldom, sages never, but speakers, bards, diplomatists, and dancers, little that's great, but much of what is clever; most orators, but very few financiers, though all exchequer chancellors endeavour of late years to dispense with Cocker's rigours, and grow quite figurative with their figures. The poets of arithmetic are they, who, though they prove not 2 and 2 to be 5, as they might do in a modest way, have plainly made it out that 4 are 3, judging by what they take and what they pay. The sinking fund's unfathomable sea, that most unliquidating liquid, leaves the debt unsunk, yet sinks all it receives. While Adeline dispensed her airs and graces, the fair Fitzfalk seemed very much at ease. Though too well bred to quiz men to their faces, her laughing blue eyes with a glance could seize the ridicules of people in all places, that honey of your fashionable bees, and store it up for mischievous enjoyment; and this at present was her kind employment. However, the day closed as days must close, the evening also waned, and coffee came, each carriage was announced, and ladies rose, and curtsying off, as curtsies country dame, retired. With most unfashionable bows their docile esquires also did the same, delighted with their dinner and their host, but with the Lady Adeline the most. Some praised her beauty, others her great grace, the warmth of her politeness, whose sincerity was obvious in each feature of her face, whose trays were radiant with the rays of verity. Yes, she was truly worthy her high place, no one could envy her deserved prosperity. And then her dress, what beautiful simplicity Draperied her form with curious felicity! Meanwhile sweet Adeline reserved their praises, By an impartial indemnification For all her past exertion and soft phrases, In a most edifying conversation, Which turn'd upon their late guests' means and faces, And families, even to the last relation, Their hideous wives, their horrid selves and dresses, And truculent distortion of their tresses. True, she said little; 'twas the rest that broke Forth into universal epigram. But then 'twas to the purpose what she spoke, Like Addison's faint praise, so wont to damn; Her own but served to set off every joke, As music chimes in with a melodram. How sweet the task to shield an absent friend! I ask but this of mine, to not defend. There were but two exceptions to this keen skirmish Of wits or the departed: one Aurora with her pure and placid mien, And Juan too, in general behind none In gay remark on what he had heard or seen, Sat silent now, his usual spirits gone. In vain he heard the others rail or rally, He would not join them in a single sally. 'Tis true, he saw Aurora look as though She approved his silence; she perhaps mistook Its motive for that charity we owe But seldom pay the absent, nor would look Farther: it might or might not be so. But Juan sitting silent in his nook, Observing little in his reverie, Yet saw this much, which he was glad to see. The ghost at least had done him this much good, In making him as silent as a ghost, If in the circumstances which ensued He gain'd esteem where it was worth the most. And certainly Aurora had renew'd In him some feelings he had lately lost, Or harden'd; feelings which, perhaps ideal, Are so divine that I must deem them real: The love of higher things and better days, The unbounded hope and heavenly ignorance Of what is called the world and the world's ways; The moments when we gather from a glance More joy than from all future pride or praise, Which kindle manhood, but can ne'er entrance The heart in an existence of its own, Of which another's bosom is the zone. Who would not sigh, ay, tan Cytherean, That hath a memory, or that had a heart? Alas, her star must fade like that of Dian; Ray fades on ray as years on years depart. Anacreon only had the soul to tie An unwithering myrtle round the unblunted dart Of Eros. But though thou hast play'd us many tricks, Still we respect thee, Alma Venus genitrix. And full of sentiments, sublime as billows Heaving between this world and worlds beyond, Don Juan, when the midnight hour of pillows Arrived, retired to his, but to despond Rather than rest. Instead of poppies, willows waved o'er his couch. He meditated, fond of those sweet bitter thoughts Which banish sleep, and make the worldling sneer, The youngling weep. The night was as before; he was undress'd, Saving his nightgown, which is an undress, Completely sans culotte, and without vest. In short, he hardly could be clothed with less; But, apprehensive of his spectral guest, He sate with feelings awkward to express By those who have not had such visitations, Expectant of the ghost's fresh operations. And not in vain he listen'd. Hush! What's that? I see. Oh no, 'tis not! Yet 'tis, ye powers, it is the pooh, the cat. The devil may take that stealthy pace of his, So like a spiritual pitter-pat, Or tiptoe of an amatory miss, Gliding the first time to a rendezvous, And dreading the chaste echoes of her shoe. Again, what is't? The wind? No, this time it is the sable friar as before, With awful footsteps, regular as rhyme, Or, as rhymes may be in these days, much more. Again, through shadows of the night sublime, when deep sleep fell on men, and the world wore the starry darkness round her like a girdle spangled with gems, the monk made his blood curdle. A noise like to wet fingers drawn on glass, which sets the teeth on edge, and a slight clatter like showers which on the midnight gusts will pass, sounding like very supernatural water, came over Juan's ears, which throbbed, alas! For immaterialism's a serious matter, so that even those whose faith is the most great in souls immortal shun them tête-à-tête. Were his eyes open? Yes, and his mouth too. Surprise has this effect, to make one dumb, yet leave the gate which eloquence slips through as wide as if a long speech were to come. Nigh and more nigh the awful echoes drew, tremendous to a mortal tympanum. His eyes were open, and, as was before stated, his mouth. What opened next? The door. It opened with a most infernal creak, like that of hell. Lasciate ogni speranza voi che entrate, the hinges seem to speak, dreadful as Dante's Rima, or this stanza, but all words upon such themes are weak. A single shade sufficient to entrance hero, for what is substance to a spirit? Or housed matter trembles to come near it. The door flew wide, not swiftly, but as fly the seagulls, with a steady sober flight, and then swung back, nor close, but stood awry, half letting in long shadows on the light, which still in Juan's candlesticks burned high, for he had two, both tolerably bright, and in the doorway, darkening darkness, stood the sable friar in his solemn hood. Don Juan shook, as erst he had been shaken the night before, but being sick of shaking, he first inclined to think he had been mistaken, and then to be ashamed of such mistaking. His own internal ghost began to awaken within him, and to quell his corporate quaking, hinting that soul and body on the whole were odds against a disembodied soul. And then his dread grew wrath, and his wrath fierce, and he arose, advanced, the shade retreated. But Juan, eager now the truth to pierce, followed, his veins no longer cold but heated, resolved to thrust the mystery, cart and tierce, at whatsoever risk of being defeated. The ghost stopped, menaced, then retired, until he reached the ancient wall, then stood stone still. Juan put forth one arm. Eternal powers! It touch'd no soul nor body, but the wall, on which the moonbeams fell in silvery showers, chequer'd with all the tracery of the hall. He shudder'd, as no doubt the bravest cowers, when he can't tell what is't that doth appall. How odd a single hobgoblin's nonentity should cause more fear than a whole host's identity! But still the shade remain'd, the blue eyes glared, and rather variably for a stony death. Yet one thing rather good the grave had spared, the ghost had a remarkably sweet breath. A straggling curl show'd he had been fair-haired, a red lip, with 2 rows of pearls beneath, gleam'd forth, as through the casement's ivory shroud the moon peep'd, just escaped from a grey cloud, and Juan, puzzled, but still curious, thrust his other arm forth. Wonder upon wonder, it press'd upon a hard but glowing bust, which beat as if there was a warm heart under. He found, as people on most trials must, that he had made at first a silly blunder, and that in his confusion he had caught only the wall instead of what he sought. The ghost, if ghost it were, seem'd a sweet soul as ever lurked beneath the holy hood. A dimpled chin, a neck of ivory, stole forth into something much like flesh and blood. Back fell the sable frock and dreary cowl, and they reveal'd, alas, that ere they should, in full voluptuous but not all grown bulk, the phantom of her frolic grace, Fitzfulke. End of Canto 16 of Don Juan, by Gordon Lord Byron. Read by Peter Gallagher.